Hello, my dear friends. They wore silk, danced under gaslight, and powdered their faces to perfection. Yet under those glamorous Parisian gowns, something was rotting. Behind every perfume bottle and lacy glove hid a secret the city never spoke of. No one warned you how dangerous lace underwear could be. No one dared whisper what infections festered beneath corsets. Why did so many Parisian women die silently from mystery illnesses? Tonight we'll peel back the satin and step into the hidden hygiene horrors of 1920s Paris. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. Paris at dusk settles like velvet across the Seine, the gas lamps flickering to life along cobblestone streets, where horse-drawn carriages click their way through shadows. The year is 1925, and the city breathes with the rhythm of jazz, champagne bubbles rising in crystal glasses, and silk dresses swaying to the sound of orchestras that play until dawn. This is the Paris of dreams, where artists gather in smoke-filled cafes, where perfume drifts from every doorway, and where women walk like queens beneath the golden glow of streetlights. Yet if you were to step closer, close enough to catch the scent that lingers just beneath the roses and lavender, you might notice something else entirely, something that whispers of secrets kept behind lace curtains and powder-covered mirrors. The boulevards stretch wide and magnificent, lined with trees that rustle their leaves like the silk of evening gowns. Women emerge from carriages, their faces pale as porcelain, their hair arranged in perfect waves that catch the light and hold it like captured starlight. They move with grace learned from childhood, taught to carry themselves as though they are walking on air, as though their bodies are merely vessels for beauty and refinement. But beneath those carefully arranged curls, beneath the layers of fabric that flow like water around their forms, there are stories that no one tells, stories of discomfort that cannot be spoken, of small daily struggles that remain hidden behind painted smiles and carefully modulated voices. In the boudoir of Montmartre, where mirrors reflect faces transformed by powder and rouge, women gather around dressing tables laden with bottles and brushes. The ritual of preparation takes hours, each layer of cosmetics applied with the precision of an artist working on canvas. Yet as they paint their faces and arrange their hair, there is an undercurrent of unease, a sense that all is not quite as perfect as it appears. The silk stockings that caress their legs, the lace undergarments that rest against their skin, the corsets that shape their figures into the ideal of feminine beauty, all carry with them secrets that polite society refuses to acknowledge. The narrow streets of the old city wind like ribbons between buildings that lean toward each other as if sharing whispered confidences. In these shadowed passages, where the gaslight barely penetrates, women hurry past with their skirts held carefully above the damp stones. They move quickly, not from any sense of urgency, but from a desire to avoid lingering too long in places where their carefully maintained appearances might be challenged by the realities of urban life. The city itself seems to conspire with them in this dance of concealment, offering dark corners and closed doors behind which the true business of daily existence can be conducted away from prying eyes. Water weakens health, so the doctors warned, their voices carrying the weight of medical authority that few dared to question. In the consulting rooms of respected physicians, women were told that frequent bathing could drain the strength from their bodies, that too much water might loosen the very essence of their femininity and leave them vulnerable to all manner of illness. These warnings spread through drawing rooms and tea parlors like gospel, repeated by mothers to daughters, by friends to friends, until the entire city seemed to believe that water itself was an enemy to be approached with caution and suspicion. If one imagines the daily life of women in Paris during these golden years, The first surprise is often the way they approach the matter of cleanliness. Water, which today feels so ordinary and essential, was regarded with a wariness that bordered on fear. Many women did not step into baths filled with warm water, as we might picture in our modern minds. Instead, they relied on cloths soaked in perfumed spirits, wiping their skin with the belief that this ritual would provide all the freshness their bodies required. The method gave the impression of cleanliness without the risks they associated with immersion, a habit born of both cultural belief and practical necessity that was repeated. In homes across the city, without question or doubt, the concern with water came from long-standing medical beliefs that bathing could weaken the constitution and open the pores too widely, allowing illness to slip inside like an unwelcome visitor. Women repeated these warnings among themselves, convinced that avoiding water was a way to protect their health and preserve their strength. For many, the thought of soaking in a tub was genuinely unsettling, especially during the cold months when drafts filled even the finest apartments and made the idea of wet skin seem dangerous. Cloths dipped in fragrant alcohol became the safer path, promising to wipe away the day's accumulation of sweat while leaving behind the strong scent of flowers or herbs that would mask any lingering odors. There was also the practical matter of cost and labor that influenced these choices. Heating enough water for a full bath was not a simple task that could be accomplished with the turn of a faucet. Firewood and coal were expensive commodities, and servants needed hours to carry, heat, and prepare a proper tub. For poorer families, this luxury was simply impossible to afford. For the wealthier households, it was seen as an indulgence not meant for everyday use, but reserved for special occasions or times of particular need. The compromise was the perfumed cloth, quick to use, practical in its application, and respectable in the eyes of society. The act itself carried its own small ritual of care and attention. A basin would be set upon a table, bottles of scented spirits arranged nearby like soldiers in formation, and cloths folded neatly in preparation for use. Women would dab their faces, necks, and arms with methodical precision, avoiding the effort and potential danger of full immersion in water. The sting of alcohol on the skin provided a sensation of sharp cleanliness, and the perfume that followed masked whatever sweat and odor lingered from the day's activities. Neighbors and visitors who caught a whiff of lavender or rose believed the woman had taken proper care of herself, never realizing how little actual water had been involved in the process. This practice was also deeply tied to matters of social status and respectability. True bathing was still seen by many as a medical treatment, something done at spas or on the advice of a physician for specific ailments. To clean oneself at home with scented spirits was considered elegant, suggesting refinement and proper restraint. Water, in contrast, was associated with the working classes who washed themselves in public fountains or in shared basins after long hours of labor. For Parisian women who wished to appear refined and proper, avoiding water was as much a statement of class as it was a habit of cleanliness. Yet there were hidden costs to this approach that few were willing to acknowledge. The alcohol dried and irritated the skin, leaving it raw and sometimes painful to the touch. Without real washing, layers of dirt and sweat built up beneath clothing, causing discomfort and creating conditions where disease could flourish. But because this discomfort appeared slowly and was shared by so many, few connected it with their daily routines of perfumed wiping. The sting of alcohol was mistaken for the sensation of purity, and the faint redness of irritated skin was dismissed as nothing more than sensitivity. The cultural weight of appearances cannot be ignored in understanding these practices. In an era when women's respectability was measured by the smallest details of clothing, posture, and behavior, the act of scented wiping seemed sufficient to meet social expectations. To be seen carrying bottles of rosewater or lavender spirits was a mark of refinement and proper care. To be known for regular bathing might even raise suspicions of illness or impropriety. The irony was sharp and undeniable. What we now recognize as unhealthy was in their eyes a symbol of both health and elevated social status. Inside homes across the city, bottles of perfumed alcohol became as common as soap might be in another household. They were displayed in cabinets as symbols of refinement, gifted among friends as tokens of affection, and advertised in magazines as essential elements of the modern woman's daily routine. The industry that produced these fragrances thrived on the very avoidance of water, offering endless varieties of scents to keep up This reliance on alcohol and perfume shaped not only private life, but also the public impressions that visitors and residents formed of Parisian society. Guests to the city often remarked on the strong perfumes that filled salons and theaters, believing this to be a mark of sophistication and elegance, unaware that it was also a mask for the absence of true bathing. What was seen as the height of chic was at its core a response to fear, poverty, and misinformation about the nature of cleanliness and health. The belief in perfumed wiping was so deeply rooted in the culture that reform would not come quickly or easily. These habits were tied to identity and class, woven into the very fabric of what it meant to be a respectable Parisian woman. Only with the gradual spread of modern plumbing and changing medical advice would attitudes slowly begin to shift. But in these early decades of the century, to wipe oneself with scented spirits was to be modern, clean, and respectable, no matter what science might one day reveal about the true nature of hygiene. The story of perfumed wiping serves as a reminder of how fragile and changeable the meaning of cleanliness can be across time and culture. It shows how appearances can hide uncomfortable realities, and how even the simplest acts of daily care are shaped by complex forces of culture, class, and deeply held fears. The women of Paris in the 1920s believed they were protecting themselves and maintaining their health, while in truth they were merely layering fragrance over accumulated dirt and sweat, creating an illusion of purity that satisfied social expectations while leaving their bodies vulnerable to the very problems they sought to avoid. From this careful ritual of avoiding water, attention naturally turns to the garments themselves, those prized possessions that were treated with such reverence that they rarely encountered soap or proper cleaning. Silk and velvet gowns, the treasured clothing of Parisian women in these glittering years, were almost never washed in water. The delicate fibers could not tolerate soap or scrubbing, and the specialized cleaners who understood how to handle such precious fabrics were expensive and difficult to find. Instead, these magnificent dresses were hung near open windows to catch whatever breeze might freshen them, or laid out in patches of sunlight for hours at a time. This practice did not truly remove the accumulated dirt and sweat that had settled into the fabric, but it created the impression of freshness and care that satisfied both the wearer and anyone who might observe her. Perfume became the answer to what airing alone could not accomplish. Bottles of heavy floral scents were kept within easy reach, and women would discreetly spray the fabric in areas where perspiration was most likely to gather, particularly under the arms or along the seams where the body pressed most closely against the cloth. The sharpness of the fragrance masked the sour smell of accumulated sweat, creating an aura of sweetness that defined elegance for anyone who came near. The sweet perfume represented sophistication and proper care, covering the truth that the gown had not been properly cleaned in weeks or even months. Powder also played its essential part in this elaborate deception. Talc was dusted generously onto the lining of skirts and bodices, designed to soak up the dampness of skin, pressed against layers of fabric throughout long days and evenings. This prevented the most obvious stains from appearing on the outer surface, but it created a strange mixture of sweat and powder that clung to the cloth and gave off a distinct, chalky scent that mingled with whatever perfume had been applied. From a distance, especially in the flattering light of candles or gas lamps, the gown would look absolutely immaculate, shimmering with beauty and elegance. But up close, the illusion began to show its cracks and inconsistencies. The garments themselves were indeed works of extraordinary craftsmanship and artistry. Velvet glowed with rich, deep hues that caught and held the light, while silk moved like liquid starlight with every gesture and step. Yet beneath their undeniable beauty, these fabrics absorbed every trace of the body that wore them. The sweat from dancing through long evenings, the smoke from crowded salons, and the musty air of city streets. Without proper washing, these traces accumulated day after day, week after week, until the very threads held memories of every moment they had been worn. The social rules of the time supported and even encouraged this illusion of cleanliness through appearance alone. Respectability was judged by how one looked and smelled in public spaces, not by the hidden reality of the fabric against the skin. A woman could be praised for her elegance and refinement while wearing a gown that had not touched water in months, as long as the surface appeared fresh and carried the proper fragrance. The judgment of cleanliness had become entirely divorced from the actual state of cleanliness, creating a world where appearance was everything and reality mattered very little. Yet this careful preservation of expensive garments carried its own hidden risks and consequences. Moisture trapped in unwashed cloth encouraged bacteria to grow and multiply in the warm, dark spaces between fabric and skin. Women who wore the same gown repeatedly developed rashes, redness, and persistent irritation where the cloth rubbed against their bodies. Still, few would admit or even recognize the connection between their discomfort and the practice of re-wearing unwashed garments. If pain or irritation appeared, it was explained away as sensitivity to weather, nervousness, or simply the burden that women were expected to bear as part of their nature. For many women, the choice to preserve rather than clean their gowns was not just about elegance but about practical necessity. Wealth might allow for multiple beautiful dresses, but middle-class families often owned only a few truly fine garments. The risk of washing and potentially destroying such costly items was simply too great to contemplate. Social events demanded proper appearances, and a woman could not arrive at a gathering in a stained or faded dress. Yet she could not afford to constantly replace her wardrobe either. Perfume and powder offered what seemed like a reasonable solution, allowing the gown to survive while the woman maintained her social standing, even if the truth was hidden beneath layers of carefully applied scent. Inside the homes of these women, elaborate rituals developed around the care and preservation of these precious garments. Dresses hung in wardrobes with small sachets of lavender or rose petals tucked carefully between the folds, another attempt to keep unpleasant odors at bay through the power of fragrance. These little bags of dried flowers gave the entire wardrobe a pleasant smell that visitors would notice and praise, commenting on the woman's refined taste and attention to detail. Yet no one asked when the gowns themselves had last encountered actual water, because such questions were not part of polite conversation. Respectability rested entirely in what could be seen and smelled on the surface, not in what remained hidden beneath. This practice shaped the very culture of cleanliness in Parisian society. To re-wear an unwashed gown was not considered shameful or improper, but practical and even wise. To protect delicate fabrics from the potential damage of washing was praised as good sense and careful stewardship. The lingering sense that resulted from this approach became part of the distinctive atmosphere of Parisian salons and theaters, where heavy perfume mixed with smoke and dust to create a haze that clung to every surface and seemed to define the very air of sophisticated society. The dresses themselves told their own stories to anyone who knew how to read the signs. They shone beautifully in the evening light, swayed gracefully as their wearers moved through crowded rooms, and carried with them every secret of accumulated sweat and desperately applied perfume. What was hidden beneath the surface remained carefully unspoken, yet it influenced the health and comfort of every woman in ways that were never acknowledged or addressed. Only with the passage of time and the development of modern cleaning methods would these particular habits begin to fade. But in the 1920s, This practice was so routine and accepted that it shaped how women presented themselves to society, and how society judged their worth and respectability. These magnificent dresses looked absolutely flawless in the warm glow of evening lamps and the flattering light of social gatherings. Yet beneath their polished surfaces, they carried layer upon layer of accumulated sweat and hastily applied powder, creating an illusion of refinement that held strong only as long as no one looked too closely or asked too many questions. What women wore under those carefully preserved gowns, however, revealed an even more troubling reality about the daily struggles of maintaining the appearance of cleanliness in a world where actual cleanliness was neither practical nor properly understood. Woolen stockings clung tightly to the legs of Parisian women throughout these years, but they were washed so rarely that they became stiff with accumulated perspiration and city grime. The thick fabric was excellent at trapping heat, but it also trapped sweat, dust, and odors, holding them far longer than anyone cared to admit or acknowledge. Because most families owned only a few pairs of stockings, and because they were costly to replace, these essential garments were worn again and again until they became rigid with dried sweat and dirt. Women attempted to refresh them by hanging them near windows or laying them over chairs to catch whatever air might circulate. But the smell and the stiffness never truly disappeared. The stockings carried within their fibers the accumulated memory of days spent walking through crowded, dusty streets, and when they were pulled on each morning, they pressed those memories back against the skin in the form of odor and irritation. Each day added another layer to what was already there, building up a history of use that the fabric could not forget or release. The woolen material, while warm and practical, created the perfect environment for bacteria to thrive in the dark. Moist space between skin and cloth. Leather shoes presented an entirely different but equally troubling problem. Most shoes of the period lacked proper linings that could absorb moisture, leaving sweat to settle in the dark, enclosed space within the shoe itself. Hours of wear in these conditions created the perfect breeding ground for fungal infections, which spread silently and persistently between the toes and under the nails. The sharp, sour smell that inevitably drifted from these shoes was impossible to ignore, but because shoes were such expensive investments, they were worn regardless of their condition or the discomfort they caused. A woman might spend considerable time and effort polishing the outer surface of her shoes until they gleamed with respectability, all while completely ignoring the festering dampness that grew stronger with each wearing. The contrast was both striking and somehow representative of the broader approach to cleanliness that characterized the era, where surfaces were maintained while the hidden reality was allowed to deteriorate without acknowledgement or care. The matter of undergarments was perhaps the most telling example of the compromises that women were forced to make in their daily lives. Silk underwear was not only expensive, but also extremely delicate and difficult to clean without causing damage. Many women owned only 1 or 2 pairs of such garments, and some chose to go without them altogether when they were at home, finding this to be more practical than risking the destruction of such costly items through frequent washing. This choice was whispered about in private conversations, but rarely spoken of openly. Yet it was a practical solution to an impossible situation. The reality of going without proper undergarments became an unspoken habit that many women adopted out of necessity rather than choice. Together, these items, the stockings that held odor, the shoes that bred infection, and the undergarments that were either damaged by washing or absent altogether, formed the invisible foundation of daily life for Parisian women. These were the garments closest to the body, the ones that absorbed heat and moisture most directly, yet they were also the least cared for and most neglected aspects of personal hygiene. Women dressed themselves each morning in layers that might smell pleasant on the surface but carried a completely different reality against their skin. The scent of perfume generously applied To address could mask the immediate smell of perspiration, but it could do nothing about stockings that held weeks of accumulated odor, or shoes that released their own unmistakable reminders of bacterial growth with every step. Respectability was judged entirely by what could be seen and smelled from a social distance, not by what was experienced in the intimate space between clothing and skin. The physical consequences of these practices were clear and persistent. Though they were often dismissed or ignored, redness appeared on skin, where stockings rubbed persistently against the same spots day after day. Painful blisters formed in damp shoes that never had the chance to properly dry between wearings. Irritation and infection spread in areas where silk undergarments, when they were worn, went far too long without proper cleaning. These discomforts were accepted as ordinary parts of life, as natural burdens that women were expected to bear without complaint. Rather than pointing to their own habits as the source of these problems, women attributed their pain to changes in weather, their own constitutions, or simply bad luck. Inside homes throughout the city, the evidence of these struggles was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Stockings hung by fireplaces, drying stiff and retaining their shape even when empty, testament to the accumulated substances that had hardened within the fibers. Shoes rested by doors, their outer surfaces polished to a shine that spoke of care and attention, while their interiors remained damp and unwelcoming. Underwear, when it was washed at all, was cleaned hastily by hand in small basins, with the delicate silk often stretching and deteriorating under the harsh treatment of soap and scrubbing. Many women, faced with the choice between wearing damaged undergarments or preserving them by avoiding washing, chose preservation over cleanliness, leaving the precious silk unworn for long stretches of time while they made do with whatever alternatives they could improvise. The cycle repeated endlessly, creating a situation where the garments that were most essential for comfort and hygiene were also the ones that received the least attention and care. The silence that surrounded these particular aspects of daily life was both profound and telling. To speak openly about the condition of stockings or the problems caused by poor foot hygiene was considered deeply improper and unsuitable for polite conversation. Women endured their discomfort without voicing complaints, carrying their secrets beneath their carefully arranged outer garments. The demands of respectability required this silence, and silence, in turn, allowed these harmful practices to persist without challenge or reform. Society judged women based on their visible appearances rather than their hidden realities, creating a world where a woman could be praised for her elegance and refinement, while simultaneously suffering from infections and irritation caused by the very garments that created her polished image. The contrast between what was seen and what was experienced became a defining characteristic of women's lives during this period. The pursuit of elegance and social acceptability created a quiet form of suffering that was carried privately, hidden behind the polished surfaces that society demanded and rewarded. Women paid a price in physical discomfort and health for the appearance of refinement. Yet this price was never acknowledged or addressed, because it existed in the spaces that polite society refused to examine or discuss. Stockings that held persistent odors, shoes that cultivated fungal infections, and undergarments that were either rarely washed or entirely absent, revealed the hidden cost of maintaining respectability in a world where appearances mattered far more than comfort or health. Beneath the carefully polished surface of Parisian elegance lay a reality of discomfort that was carried in silence, endured without complaint, and never allowed to interfere with the performance of refinement that society demanded. Yet even these hidden struggles would pale in comparison to the attitudes that would develop around the very odors that women worked so hard to conceal, for in some circles, what others called offensive would come to be celebrated as authentic and even desirable. Among certain progressive groups in Paris during these transformative years, the natural scent of the human body began to be celebrated in ways that would seem unusual and even shocking by today's standards. Artists, writers, and performers in particular began to treat body odor not as something shameful to be hidden, but as something authentic and vital, a true signal of life and passion that artificial perfumes could never hope to replicate. To these individuals, perfume might be pleasant and socially acceptable, but it was also artificial, a mask that concealed what they believed to be the real beauty and truth of human existence. The natural scent of sweat, of skin left untouched by excessive washing or heavy chemical treatments, became part of a new language of attraction and authenticity. It was no longer whispered about with shame and embarrassment, but praised openly with words that gave it dignity and even romanticism. For many women who were influenced by these ideas, this cultural shift changed not only how they understood their own bodies, but also how they chose to present themselves to the world and to potential romantic partners. Letters and diary entries from this period reveal this strange and fascinating cultural phenomenon in remarkable detail. Lovers described each other's natural odors with the same care and attention that might be devoted to describing a work of art, recalling with fondness the sweetness of perspiration after hours of dancing or the heavy, intoxicating musk that lingered after long walks through the hot streets of the city. The scent that clung naturally to the body was treated like a precious treasure, something intimate and personal that no manufactured perfume could ever truly replace or improve. Upon some women began to believe that their natural odor was more powerful and alluring than any expensive gown or piece of jewelry they might wear. They carried themselves with a new kind of confidence, reassured by the idea that what had once been a source of embarrassment could now be seen as genuinely attractive and desirable. The cultural shift gave them permission to embrace aspects of their physical existence. This belief system also had practical consequences that shaped daily habits and routines. Many women stopped trying to mask or eliminate underarm odor through the use of harsh powders or chemical treatments. Deodorants and antiperspirants existed during this period, but they were often made with ingredients that burned or irritated the skin, and they were not widely trusted or accepted. Instead of applying these potentially harmful substances, women began to allow themselves to perspire freely beneath their gowns, telling themselves that men actually preferred this natural state. That authentic biology was more appealing than any artificial attempt to alter or disguise it. This practice created an interesting blend of practicality and romance, rooted simultaneously in convenience and in cultural fashion. Women found that they could justify avoiding harsh chemical treatments by embracing a philosophy that celebrated naturalness, turning necessity into a form of sophisticated choice. The artistic and intellectual world provided credibility and respectability for these ideas about the beauty of natural scent. Painters and poets began to praise what they called the truth of human smell, describing perspiration and natural body odor as the very essence of passion and authentic feeling. Plays and novels contained subtle and not-so-subtle hints about lovers who embraced each other without shame or disgust, intoxicated by the honest smells of unmasked humanity. What might have been considered vulgar or inappropriate in an earlier age was redefined as authentic and even sophisticated. The influence of modern literature and progressive thinking helped to spread these ideas slowly, from the artistic circles of Montmartre into more conventional and respectable households. In the busy public spaces of Paris, these philosophical ideas took on very physical and practical forms. Theaters, cafes, and dance halls became filled with a complex mixture of scents that would have been overwhelming to visitors from other cities or eras. Perfume was still present, thick and sweet as it had always been, but it now blended with the unmistakable sharpness of human perspiration in ways that created entirely new olfactory experiences. For wealthy women, this mixture of natural and artificial scents was largely a matter of choice and philosophy. For poorer women, who had limited access to expensive perfumes and cleaning facilities. This new cultural acceptance gave them a strange kind of equality, where their natural state was no longer automatically mocked or dismissed, but could sometimes be praised and celebrated. Yet the contradiction inherent in this cultural shift was obvious to anyone who cared to examine it closely. Paris continued to pride itself on refinement, elegance, and sophisticated taste. But this refined society now included the deliberate acceptance of odors that revealed the absence of what most people would consider basic cleanliness. A woman might spend hours carefully arranging her hair and applying cosmetics, selecting her finest velvet gown and most delicate jewelry, only to deliberately leave her underarms untouched by any cleaning or deodorizing substance, convinced that this combination of artificial elegance and natural smell was more desirable than either element alone. Medical professionals were not entirely silent about the potential risks of this cultural trend. Doctors and health experts noted in their journals and publications that bacteria thrived on unwashed skin, and that constant dampness and the accumulation of perspiration could lead quickly to irritation, infection, and more serious health problems. But these scientific warnings struggled to compete against the powerful cultural fascination with authenticity and naturalness. To many women, the voice of science seemed cold and clinical compared to the voice of art and romance. They found it easier to trust the poet who described sweat as a mark of genuine passion than the doctor who described the same phenomenon as potentially unhygienic and dangerous. The result of this cultural conflict was that body odor became less of a medical or practical issue and more of a romantic and philosophical symbol, something that carried meaning beyond its immediate physical reality. Inside homes throughout the city, this new attitude created small but significant changes in daily routines and habits. Women no longer felt compelled to rush to clean themselves immediately after any form of physical exertion or perspiration. Instead, they might air out a dress, reapply a light dusting of powder, and trust that their natural scent would enhance rather than diminish their overall attractiveness and appeal. Husbands and lovers were expected to notice and appreciate this authentic aspect of their partners, and in some relationships, the memory of a beloved's distinctive odor was described as deeply personal and meaningful, sometimes even more powerful and lasting than the memory of words spoken or gestures shared. The human body itself had been transformed, in the minds of these progressive thinkers, into a kind of living perfume that was far superior to anything that could be manufactured or purchased. But this romantic redefinition of natural body odor carried hidden costs that were not always acknowledged or discussed. Women still suffered from the same rashes, skin irritation, and persistent discomfort that had always accompanied poor hygiene, but now these problems were made worse by the deliberate decision to avoid washing or treating areas where sweat accumulated. Without regular cleaning, bacteria continued to spread and multiply more easily than ever. Yet because these health issues were so common and widespread, they continued to be seen as normal and natural, rather than as preventable problems that could be addressed through proper care. The physical pain and discomfort became folded into cultural ideas about femininity itself, treated as another burden that women were expected to carry silently and without complaint. These new attitudes about the beauty of natural odor meant that women were actually encouraged to embrace conditions that caused them physical irritation and potential illness, all in the name of authenticity and romantic appeal. Often encouraged by men who never had to live with the same discomfort or health consequences, the broader cultural paradox extended well beyond individual households and into the public spaces where Parisian society displayed itself most proudly. This was still a city that defined itself through fashion, beauty, and carefully maintained surfaces designed for public admiration and international recognition. Yet beneath those polished surfaces, women were now being told to embrace what was hidden, unrefined and deliberately unaltered by the tools of modern hygiene. This contradiction between surface elegance and deliberate uncleanliness did not strike most people as odd or problematic at the time, because they had learned to accept that a gown could be immaculate while the body beneath it carried the honest sweat of authentic living. The Hygiene combination of artificial and natural elements created the distinctive atmosphere that filled salons and theaters throughout the city, spaces that were heavy with both floral sweetness and the unmistakable musk of human bodies that had chosen authenticity over conventional cleanliness. In the end, these evolving ideas about the acceptability and even desirability of body odor demonstrate how quickly and dramatically cultural values can shift and change. What one generation condemns as unacceptable, another may celebrate as sophisticated and enlightened. What seems obvious and natural in one era can be completely redefined in the next through the influence of art, literature, and changing social attitudes. The women of 1920s Paris lived through a unique moment when perspiration was not shameful but potentially seductive, when body odor could be marketed as a form of authenticity, and when health considerations were often secondary to cultural and romantic ideals. The fact that so many people accepted these ideas without serious question reveals just how powerful culture can be in shaping even the most intimate details of daily life and personal care. Some women found genuine pride and confidence in carrying their natural scent as though it were a precious treasure, convinced by artists and intellectuals that this made them more attractive and authentic than their more conventionally clean counterparts. This strange cultural celebration of what had once been considered a flaw turned neglect into a form of sophisticated charm, giving intellectual legitimacy to practices that might otherwise have been seen as simple lack of care. Yet behind the romantic glow of powder and perfume, behind the progressive ideas about authenticity and naturalness, the skin itself began to suffer in ways that would soon require another layer of beauty. Cosmetics in Paris during these glittering years served a purpose that extended far beyond simple beauty and adornment. They were tools of concealment, designed to hide the evidence of the very lifestyle that made them necessary. Faces that appeared flawlessly pale and smooth from a distance were often covered in thick layers of powder and paint that concealed blemishes, irritation, and damage caused by the daily accumulation of dust, perspiration, and the absence of proper cleansing routines. The city's streets filled the air with smoke from countless chimneys, and the dust kicked up by horses and carriages, and women's skin suffered daily from clogged pores and persistent irritation that could not be properly addressed without effective methods of cleaning. Without reliable ways to cleanse their faces thoroughly, women came to rely heavily on cosmetic powders to create the illusion of perfect skin. The thicker the layer of powder, the more convincing the deception became, at least under the forgiving light of gas lamps or candles that softened harsh realities and made everything appear more beautiful than it truly was. Under artificial lighting, these heavily powdered faces appeared smooth, pale and absolutely perfect, with every imperfection buried beneath layers of carefully applied cosmetics. What made this daily routine even more dangerous was the composition of the cosmetic products themselves, which contained substances that are now recognized as highly toxic and harmful. Powders and creams routinely contained lead, mercury, and other heavy metals that women applied to their faces day after day, year after year, without any understanding of the long-term consequences. They did not know these risks, or if they had heard warnings. They dismissed them because every magazine and advertisement praised these products as absolutely essential elements of modern womanhood and sophisticated beauty. The more they used these toxic cosmetics, the worse their underlying skin problems became, creating a vicious cycle that trapped women in increasingly harmful routines. Blemishes and irritation grew worse under the constant application of poisonous chemicals, which meant that even more powder and paint was needed to cover the damage, which in turn caused deeper and more persistent harm to the skin beneath. Women found themselves unable to appear in public without these cosmetic masks. Yet the very products they depended on were slowly destroying the health of their skin. At night, the idea of removing these layers of cosmetics had not yet become a widely accepted part of women's routines. There were no gentle cleansing products specifically designed for skincare, no mild lotions marketed for healing or repair, and no understanding that the skin needed time to breathe and recover from the day's accumulation of cosmetics and environmental damage. Instead, women often went to bed with their faces still fully painted, allowing the powders and creams to rub off onto pillows, mix with perspiration, and press back into pores throughout the night. In the morning, rather than starting with a clean face, another layer of cosmetics was simply added on top of whatever remained from the day before. This cycle of layering and reapplying continued day after day without interruption, creating a permanent mask that the skin was never allowed to escape. The constant presence of these chemicals prevented natural healing and created conditions where irritation and infection could flourish unchecked. This approach to cosmetics fundamentally shaped how women understood themselves and their place in society. To appear in public without makeup was considered not just improper, but genuinely shameful, a sign that a woman had failed in her basic duties of self-presentation and social respectability. A pale, heavily powdered face became the universal symbol of refinement and proper care, a signal that the wearer belonged to the cultured and sophisticated world of Parisian society. Women believed they could not step outside their homes without this cosmetic armor, and many kept their faces painted even within their own households, in case visitors might arrive unexpectedly and find them unprepared. The medical consequences of these practices were harsh and unmistakable, though they were rarely discussed or acknowledged openly. Persistent redness spread across cheeks and foreheads where the most powder was applied. Lips cracked and bled under the weight of toxic colorants that were never designed for such intimate contact with the body. Skin became rough and damaged beneath the constant application of heavy metals and harsh chemicals, but these problems were not spoken of in polite company. Women endured the discomfort quietly and privately, telling themselves that pain and irritation were simply part of what it meant to be beautiful and respectable. The cosmetics industry actively reinforced and encouraged these harmful habits through advertising campaigns that promised transformation and perfection. Posters and magazine advertisements declared that powders could provide purity, that creams could restore vitality, and that rouge could bring natural charm and attractiveness to any woman who used these products faithfully. No mention was ever made of potential side effects or long-term health consequences, and very few people had the knowledge or authority to question what chemicals and substances were actually contained in these beautiful packages. Shops throughout the city displayed endless rows of cosmetic products, packaged in elegant boxes and containers that suggested both safety and luxury. Women purchased these items eagerly and trustingly, never suspecting that they were paying good money for substances that would slowly poison and damage their skin over months and years of faithful use. The beautiful packaging and sophisticated marketing created an illusion of respectability and scientific advancement that masked the dangerous reality of what these products actually contained. Inside homes throughout Paris, dressing tables became small theaters where the daily transformation from natural to artificial beauty took place. Mirrors reflected faces that were half covered in powder and half bare, revealing the stark contrast between damaged skin and cosmetic perfection. Brushes, jars, and cloth were spread across these surfaces like the tools of an artist, each implement playing its part in the elaborate process of concealment and transformation that occupied hours of every woman's day. Husbands and children watched these routines without comment or question, because this level of cosmetic preparation was seen as natural and necessary for any respectable woman. The scent of powder filled the air and clung to curtains and clothing, creating a permanent reminder that cosmetics were as constant and essential as breathing itself. The ritual had become so deeply embedded in daily life that it was impossible to imagine existence without it. In public spaces throughout the city, these cosmetic illusions were carefully maintained and socially reinforced. Women appeared at gatherings with faces that glowed with apparent perfection under the dim lighting that was standard for evening entertainments. Compliments flowed freely, reinforcing the belief that the effort and expense were worthwhile and necessary. Yet beneath the artificial glow created by gas lamps and candlelight, skin was slowly suffocating under layers of toxic substances that prevented natural breathing and healing. The contrast between public appearance and private reality became one of the defining characteristics of beauty culture during this era. What was seen and admired in social situations bore no resemblance to what was actually happening to women's skin underneath the carefully applied cosmetics. The long-term effects of these practices became visible over time as premature aging, persistent skin problems, and chronic irritation that were all attributed to natural processes rather than to the daily application of poisonous substances. Wrinkles appeared earlier and deeper than they should have, complexions became dull and damaged, and skin infections spread in ways that seemed mysterious but were actually predictable consequences of toxic cosmetics. Because nearly every woman followed the same routines and used similar products, these conditions were treated as ordinary signs of aging rather than as preventable results of harmful beauty practices. Few people made the connection between their daily cosmetic routines and their declining skin health, because the problems developed gradually and were shared by virtually everyone in their social circles. This approach to beauty reveals a fundamental contradiction in Parisian society during this period. The city that prided itself on progress, elegance, and sophisticated understanding was quietly encouraging its women to poison themselves slowly in the name of attractiveness and social acceptability. Health was being sacrificed systematically on the altar of appearance, and silence ensured that this sacrifice remained hidden from public view and discussion. Heavy makeup served not only as a symbol of elegance and respectability, but also as a mask that trapped illness and damage beneath layers of toxic powder and paint. Women believed they were enhancing their natural beauty, while they were actually feeding the very problems they were trying to hide, creating cycles of damage and concealment that would continue for years without interruption or relief. From cosmetics designed to hide the damage caused by poor hygiene, attention turns to hair care practices that were equally misguided and potentially harmful, where the same logic of concealment and strange remedies would create even more. Hair care in Paris during these years bore little resemblance to the routines of shampooing and conditioning that would become standard in later decades. Bottled products specifically designed for washing hair were still rare, expensive, and not widely accepted as necessary or even beneficial. Many women did not consider regular hair washing to be important for health or appearance, and some actively avoided it, based on medical advice that frequent washing could weaken hair roots and cause premature hair loss. Instead of modern hair care products, women turned to traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations, applying animal fats directly onto their hair and scalp in the belief that these substances would provide necessary moisture and create the appearance of healthy shine. Lard from pigs, tallow from sheep, and other animal fats were rubbed into strands of hair with the fingers, creating a greasy coating that gave the impression of well-nourished, glossy hair, even though the effect was unpleasant by any modern standard of cleanliness or attractiveness. What mattered most to women of this era was that their hair appeared smooth, well-kept and properly maintained according to the beauty standards of their time, even if achieving this appearance required methods that would seem bizarre or repulsive to later generations. The belief that hair should not be washed frequently was not just a matter of personal preference, but was supported by widespread medical opinion and social custom. Women genuinely feared that too much contact with water and soap would damage their hair permanently, causing it to fall out or become thin and weak. Advertisements in magazines and household advice books reinforced these ideas, claiming that natural oils and animal fats were far superior to soap for maintaining strong, beautiful hair. In the absence of scientific understanding about scalp health and proper hair care, women trusted what tradition, authority figures, and popular wisdom suggested, even when the results were less than pleasant. The practice of coating hair with animal fat was seen as a sophisticated approach to beauty and healthcare, even though it created obvious problems with odor and cleanliness. Perfume once again played its essential role as a mask for the less pleasant aspects of these beauty practices. Bottles of rosewater, lavender, and other floral scents were liberally sprinkled over hair after the animal fat had been applied, creating a complex mixture of fragrances that was both sweet and slightly rancid. To people encountering this combination for the first time, the initial impression might be pleasantly floral, but as time passed and the perfume began to fade, the underlying odor of animal grease would inevitably surface and become impossible to ignore. This particular combination of scents became so common and widespread that it was often described as a characteristic element of Parisian society, something that visitors to the city would notice and remember as part of the distinctive atmosphere of sophisticated French culture. To modern senses, this mixture would probably seem overwhelming and unpleasant, but to people who had grown up with it and encountered it daily, it was simply normal and unremarkable, part of the expected background of urban life. Inside homes throughout the city, women spent considerable time and effort rubbing animal fat into their hair with their fingers, working it through their locks with wooden combs that became sticky and coated with grease over time. These combs themselves were rarely washed, partly because water was considered potentially damaging to wood, and partly because the same fears about frequent washing applied to hair care tools as well as to hair itself. Combs accumulated layers of grease, dust, and debris that were passed from one use to the next, and they were often shared between mothers and daughters, spreading whatever bacteria, lice, or infections might be present in the accumulated residue. The social and cultural meaning attached to hair made these elaborate and potentially harmful routines seem not just acceptable, but essential. Glossy, heavy hair was universally seen as a mark of vitality, health, and beauty, and women who allowed their hair to appear dry, thin, or inadequately maintained risked social criticism and whispers about their health, their character, or their commitment to proper feminine behavior. The combination of animal fat and perfume, however unpleasant it might seem to outside observers, was tolerated and even praised if it resulted in hair that appeared strong, shiny, and well cared for. Beauty was measured primarily by visual impact rather than by hygiene or health, and society was willing to overlook considerable discomfort and potential harm if the final appearance met established standards of attractiveness and respectability. Women learned to accept the smell, the greasiness, and the irritation that came with these hair care routines because the alternative, appearing in public with hair that looked neglected or poorly maintained, was simply not socially acceptable. The health consequences of these practices were significant and long-lasting, though they were rarely connected to the hair care routines that caused them. Scalp irritation was extremely common, with rashes and inflamed areas developing where animal fat clogged pores and prevented the skin from breathing properly. Dandruff flourished in the greasy environment, mixing with the applied fat to create thick, stubborn flakes that were difficult to remove and contributed to persistent itching and discomfort. Some women actually lost hair not from washing it too frequently, as they had been warned, but from never properly cleansing it at all, allowing bacteria and irritation to damage hair follicles over time. Yet these negative consequences were typically blamed on personal constitution, heredity, or environmental factors rather than on the hair care practices themselves, because everyone in their social circles followed similar routines and experienced similar problems. The commercial industry that supported these practices thrived on the combination of fear and vanity that drove women to purchase bottles of perfume and scented waters specifically designed to mask the odor of greasy hair. These businesses marketed their products as essential solutions for hair-related odor problems, encouraging women to apply even more fragrance to their already oversaturated locks. This created yet another layer in the cycle of problem and supposed solution, where more animal fat led to stronger odors, which required more perfume, which then mixed with the grease to create even more complex and sometimes overwhelming scent combinations. Daily life throughout Paris reflected this constant presence of heavily scented, greasy hair in public and private spaces. In salons and drawing rooms, the air was thick with the mixture of perfume and animal fat that rose from the heads of fashionable women. In theaters and concert halls, the combination of scents created an atmosphere that visitors often remarked upon, sometimes with admiration for what they perceived as sophisticated European refinement, and sometimes with surprise at the intensity and complexity of the aromas they encountered. Women moved through their daily routines, constantly aware of their hair, adjusting and arranging it with combs that gleamed with accumulated grease, confident that their glossy appearance was the result of proper care and attention to beauty standards. Men complimented the weight and shine of women's hair, praising the way it caught and reflected light, while carefully avoiding any mention of the less pleasant aspects of achieving such dramatic visual effects. Inside private chambers and bedrooms, jars of animal fat were stored alongside bottles of perfume on dressing tables, creating small staging areas where the daily ritual of hair care took place. Sometimes the fat was warm to make it easier to spread and work into the hair, filling these intimate spaces with the rich, heavy smell of heated animal grease that mixed with whatever perfume was applied afterward. Curtains, cushions, and bed linens absorbed these scents over time, turning entire rooms into permanent reminders of the hair care rituals that took place within them. Over the course of months and years, some medical professionals and social reformers began to raise questions about these traditional hair care methods, suggesting in small publications and private conversations that soap and water might actually be healthier for hair and scalp than the continued application of animal fats. But change came slowly and faced considerable resistance from cultural tradition, commercial interests, and the genuine fear that many women felt about altering routines that seemed to produce the glossy, impressive results that society demanded and rewarded. Only much later, with the mass production and marketing of commercial shampoos and the gradual spread of scientific understanding about scalp health, would these particular practices begin to fade from common use. For the women of the 1920s, however, animal fat and perfume remained the accepted standard for hair care, a combination that they embraced with pride even when it caused them discomfort, irritation, and persistent problems. The routine of spreading lard or tallow into hair, then masking the resulting smell with heavy applications of floral perfume, created an elaborate illusion of proper grooming, while actually contributing to scalp problems and hygiene issues that would persist for as long as these methods remained popular. Yet these grooming habits extended beyond hair care alone, encompassing tools and implements that were shared freely among family members and friends, bringing with them another hidden world of risk and cross-contamination that few people understood or acknowledged. Personal care items like combs, towels, and razors were not considered private possessions in most Parisian households during this era, but were instead treated as communal tools that could be shared openly within families, and even among friends without any concern for hygiene or the spread of infection. A single wooden comb might pass from mother to daughter, then to visiting relatives, and finally back again in an endless cycle of sharing, with no one questioning whether this practice might be unsanitary or dangerous. The comb's teeth inevitably carried strands of hair from previous users, along with flakes of dandruff, traces of the animal grease that had been applied to hair, and whatever bacteria or parasites might have been present on previous scalps. Yet this implement was treated as nothing more than a simple household tool, useful for anyone who needed to arrange their hair, regardless of who had used it most recently. Water was rarely used to clean combs properly, because the prevailing fear was that moisture would cause the wood to swell, crack, or deteriorate, leaving families reluctant to wash these tools even when they became visibly dirty or unpleasant. Face towels followed exactly the same pattern of communal use and minimal cleaning. Women would hang these cloths on balconies or near open windows, allowing whatever air and sunlight was available to pass through the fabric, in the belief that this natural process was more than sufficient to restore cleanliness and freshness. To most households of the time, this airing process was considered adequate cleaning, even though the towels remained stiff with accumulated powder, perspiration, and oils from multiple users. The fabric carried a permanent scent that was a mixture of all the substances it had absorbed over days or weeks of use, yet it was still passed from person to person without hesitation, pressed against faces and necks in the belief that it was clean and safe. Each use added another layer of contamination, creating towels that became repositories for whatever germs and bacteria had been collected from every person who had used them. Razors represented perhaps the greatest danger in this system of casual sharing, yet they were treated with the same lack of concern for individual hygiene and safety. Women who needed to shave their underarms or legs would use the same blades that had been used by others before them, often family members or friends, with no thought given to the possibility that this practice might spread infection or disease. The metal blades scraped against skin that was often already irritated from poor hygiene practices, leaving tiny cuts and abrasions that were easily overlooked but provided perfect entry points for bacteria and other harmful organisms. These microscopic wounds became pathways for serious infections, particularly since the razors themselves were rarely disinfected or properly cleaned between uses. In some households, these implements moved freely between sisters, mothers, and even neighbors, treated as casually as kitchen utensils or sewing supplies. The pain, redness, and irritation that often followed shaving were accepted as ordinary and inevitable consequences of hair removal, rather than as warning signs of potential infection or contamination. The reasoning behind this widespread sharing was both cultural and economic in nature. Personal care items were expensive purchases that many families could not afford to duplicate for each individual member, making sharing a practical necessity rather than a choice. At the same time, there was very little understanding of how disease and infection could spread through contaminated objects, since bacteria and other microorganisms were invisible to the naked eye, and their role in causing illness was not widely accepted or understood by the general public. In the absence of clear scientific knowledge about hygiene and disease transmission, people saw no compelling reason to change habits that seemed practical and efficient. Thrift and cooperation were considered virtues, while concerns about individual cleanliness seemed unnecessary and even selfish when resources were limited and family harmony depended on sharing whatever was available. These shared objects played central and important roles in the daily beauty routines that were so essential to women's social acceptability and personal confidence. Women would brush their hair with combs that were already coated with oils and residue from previous users, then dab their faces with towels that had been drying on balconies for days without proper washing. They would shave with blades that had been dulled by repeated use and contaminated by contact with multiple bodies, all while believing that they were maintaining proper standards of elegance and feminine care. The visible results of these practices appeared in the form of persistent skin infections that spread through families, rashes that developed on faces where contaminated towels had been used, and chronic irritation in areas where shared razors had created microscopic wounds. Yet these conditions were typically dismissed as individual sensitivities, environmental factors, or simply bad luck, rather than being recognized as predictable consequences of unsanitary sharing practices. Few people made the connection between the tools they used and the health problems they experienced, because so many people in their communities suffered from similar complaints that these issues seemed normal and unavoidable rather than preventable. The discomfort became accepted as just another part of ordinary existence, something that women were expected to endure without complaint or explanation. The commercial establishments that sold combs, razors, and other personal care items actively encouraged and supported this culture of sharing. Through their marketing and advertising approaches, they promoted their products as durable and long-lasting investments that could serve entire families for years, encouraging customers to think of these purchases as household necessities rather than individual tools. The concept of disposable or single-use personal care products had not yet emerged in the marketplace, and the idea that each person should have their own individual hygiene tools was not part of conventional thinking about health and cleanliness. Inside homes throughout the city, these communal objects carried their own distinctive presence and significance. A comb left carelessly on a dressing table, a towel hanging stiffly from a balcony rail, a razor resting beside a mirror. All of these items were symbols of daily life and family cooperation, but they also held invisible traces of every person who had touched them. Women did not find this troubling or concerning, because they saw the sharing as a sign of intimacy and family connection, a way of maintaining closeness and cooperation within the household. The cultural silence that surrounded discussions of personal hygiene meant that these practices were never seriously questioned or examined. To raise concerns about sharing personal care items would have suggested that family members might pose health risks to each other, an idea that seemed both impolite and frightening to people who valued family harmony and cooperation above individual health concerns. This particular form of silence allowed invisible dangers to move quietly through households and communities, disguised as ordinary expressions of kindness, thrift, and family solidarity. The very gestures that were meant to demonstrate care and consideration became vehicles for spreading illness and infection, though this irony was never recognized or acknowledged by the people who lived with its consequences day after day. Shared combs, towels, and razors created an ongoing cycle of cross-contamination that was disguised as practical family cooperation, leaving women vulnerable to infections and health problems that were never traced back to their true sources. This system of communal personal care tools represented just the beginning of health risks that women faced, for the skin conditions and infections that resulted from these practices were often dismissed as natural aspects of femininity, rather than being recognized as preventable medical problems that deserved serious attention and treatment. Skin conditions became such a constant and pervasive part of women's daily experience in Paris during this period that they were absorbed and earned to the very definition of what it meant to be female, treated as natural burdens that women were expected to carry without complaint, rather than as medical problems that deserved attention and treatment. Redness, persistent itching, and painful sores were so widespread among women of all social classes that they became nearly invisible aspects of daily life. The combination of rarely washed clothing, shared grooming tools that carried contamination from one user to another, and layers of toxic makeup that prevented skin from breathing naturally, left its unmistakable mark on virtually every woman's body. Yet instead of being recognized as obvious signs of poor hygiene or treatable infections, these physical problems were simply folded into cultural expectations about feminine suffering, treated as inevitable consequences of being born female, rather than as preventable conditions that could be addressed through better care and cleaner living habits. Stockings that remained stiff with accumulated Perspiration and street dust were among the most obvious culprits in creating persistent health problems for women's legs and feet. The wool fabric clung tightly to skin for hours at a time, trapping heat and moisture in an environment where bacteria could flourish unchecked, until painful rashes formed in areas where the rough material rubbed repeatedly against the same patches of skin. The irritated areas often split open into raw, weeping sores that refused to heal properly because the same contaminated stockings were pulled on again day after day. Women would examine these wounds with resignation rather than alarm, convinced that discomfort and pain were simply part of the price that had to be paid for maintaining a respectable appearance in public. A small area of itching or a minor wound was given no particular weight or concern, no matter how persistent or painful it became over time. In the language and thinking of the period, these problems were typically described as minor inconveniences or small trials that refined women were expected to bear with grace and dignity, rather than as genuine medical conditions that deserved treatment and care. Shoes without proper linings created their own category of persistent health problems that were similarly dismissed as ordinary aspects of feminine experience. The leather interior of most women's shoes offered no protection against the accumulation of moisture from hours of wear, creating perfect conditions for fungal infections that spread gradually but relentlessly across toes and underneath toenails. Women learned to live with the constant burning sensations, cracked heels, and unnaturally thickened nails that resulted from these chronic infections, treating them as minor nuisances rather than as signs of serious medical conditions that were slowly damaging their feet, rather than recognizing these persistent problems as infections that could potentially be treated or prevented. Women and their families spoke of them as natural weaknesses or unfortunate sensitivities, personal burdens that some individuals were simply destined to carry throughout their lives. The true causes of these conditions remained hidden beneath layers of cultural silence and medical ignorance that made it impossible for women to understand what was actually happening to their bodies or why they were suffering in ways that seemed so mysteriously persistent and unchangeable. The most disturbing aspect of this widespread normalization of illness was the way that society had developed language and cultural frameworks that transformed obvious medical problems into philosophical concepts about the nature of femininity itself. Persistent sores and fungal infections were routinely described as women's complaints, as though they were natural and inevitable byproducts of female biology, rather than preventable consequences of poor hygiene and inadequate medical care. Instead of treating these conditions as legitimate medical concerns that deserved professional attention and proper treatment, both doctors and families treated them as mysterious aspects of female nature that were best endured in silence and resignation. This cultural approach to women's health problems meant that suffering was normalized and even romanticized, while the practical steps that could have prevented or treated these conditions were never seriously considered or implemented. The transformation of medical problems into cultural expectations had the effect of silencing women who might otherwise have complained about their discomfort or sought help for their conditions. They learned to accept persistent itching, burning pain, and visible infections as unavoidable companions that were part of their identity as women, rather than as temporary problems that could potentially be solved through better hygiene, proper medical care, or changes in their daily routines and habits. Pharmacies throughout the city recognized the commercial opportunities presented by this widespread acceptance of chronic discomfort, and they filled their shelves with ointments, powders, and treatments that promised relief from the very conditions that their society was creating through poor hygiene and harmful beauty practices. These products were sold freely without any requirement for medical prescriptions or professional supervision, often containing harsh and dangerous chemicals that provided temporary sensations of relief while actually worsening the underlying infections and irritation. Many of these commercial remedies contained powerful substances like phenol, carbolic acid, or mercury compounds that literally burned the skin, creating intense sensations that women mistook for therapeutic effects. The immediate pain and stinging were interpreted as signs that the medicine was working to cleanse and heal damaged tissue, when in reality these harsh chemicals were often making infections worse and creating additional layers of damage that would require even more treatment and concealment. Advertisements for these products promised purity, strength, and feminine health, using language that suggested these treatments could restore women to their natural state of beauty and comfort. But what they actually delivered was often another layer of chemical damage that had to be hidden beneath cosmetics and endured in private, creating endless cycles of problem treatment and worsening condition that could continue for years without any real improvement or resolution. Despite the obvious discomfort and pain that these conditions caused, the cultural silence surrounding women's health problems remained so strong and pervasive that symptoms were rarely discussed, even within families, and almost never in public or social situations. Women learned to sit carefully to avoid aggravating rashes on their legs, to walk in ways that minimized the pain from infected feet, and to arrange their clothing to hide visible signs of skin problems, all while maintaining the serene and graceful demeanor that society expected from properly raised ladies. The physical evidence of these widespread health problems was visible throughout homes in subtle but unmistakable ways to anyone who knew what to look for. Women could be observed sitting with their stockings rolled down when they thought they were unobserved, frantically scratching at inflamed areas on their calves and ankles, where accumulated moisture and bacteria had created persistent irritation. Red marks bloomed visibly on skin wherever tight clothing had rubbed against infected areas, and fingers showed the damage from constant scratching at nails that had been warped and thickened by untreated fungal infections. Bedroom pillows and bed linens carried the stains and odors from the powders and creams that women applied to their skin before sleep, creating permanent reminders of the ongoing struggle against infections and discomfort that were never allowed to fully heal. Family members often shared the same afflictions without realizing it, since they also shared clothing, towels, and grooming tools that carried contamination from one person to another in an endless cycle of reinfection and cross-contamination. Despite the obvious severity and persistence of these health problems, cultural taboos made it nearly impossible for women to seek appropriate help or even to discuss their symptoms with medical professionals. The shame and embarrassment associated with admitting to skin problems or infections meant that most women suffered in complete isolation, each believing that her particular difficulties were unique personal failures rather than widespread social problems that affected virtually every woman in her community. This isolation and silence allowed harmful practices to continue unchallenged for generations, as mothers passed down the same inadequate hygiene routines to their daughters, without ever questioning whether there might be better ways to maintain health and cleanliness. What should have been recognized as a public health crisis affecting thousands of women was instead treated as a collection of individual misfortunes and personal weaknesses that were best endured in private. The broader irony of this situation becomes clear when we consider that Paris during this period was actively marketing itself to the world as a center of medical knowledge, scientific advancement, and cultural sophistication. Yet the same city that boasted of its hospitals, universities, and intellectual achievements was allowing its female population to suffer from preventable infections and treatable conditions that were being systematically ignored and misunderstood by both medical professionals and society at large. Rashes, persistent sores, and fungal infections that spread unchecked through inadequate hygiene were dismissed as ordinary aspects of feminine experience. Treated not as medical emergencies, but as natural burdens that women were expected to carry gracefully and silently. This normalization of preventable suffering reveals the deep contradictions and blind spots that existed within a culture that prided itself on refinement and progress while systematically neglecting the most basic health needs of half its population. From this widespread acceptance of skin problems as natural feminine burdens, the focus shifts to another area of health that was equally neglected and misunderstood, where even the most basic practices of dental hygiene were either unknown or considered unnecessary, leaving mouths throughout the city in states of decay and infection that polite society refused to acknowledge or address. Dental care in Paris during the 1920s existed in a world that bore almost no resemblance to modern understanding of oral hygiene and health. Toothbrushes were not standard fixtures in most homes, and commercial toothpaste was still considered an expensive novelty that was priced well beyond the reach of ordinary families. Instead of these modern conveniences, most people relied on simple and often abrasive methods to clean their teeth. If they attempted any cleaning at all beyond the most basic and occasional gestures, a handful of coarse salt rubbed directly onto tooth enamel, or a pinch of powdered charcoal smeared across gums with a finger, represented the extent of dental hygiene for most women. These harsh substances provided a temporary sensation of rough cleanliness and left the mouth feeling temporarily fresh, but they also gradually wore away protective enamel and left teeth vulnerable to the very decay and infection that proper care should have prevented. For many women throughout the city, these crude methods represented the absolute limit of their attention to dental health. Ritual gestures that were performed occasionally when they remembered or when discomfort became too obvious to ignore, but never as part of a regular daily routine that might have actually protected oral health over time. The absence of proper dental care tools and knowledge meant that most mouths were left to deteriorate gradually, without any real intervention or protection. The consequences of this widespread neglect became part of the accepted atmosphere of social gatherings throughout Paris, where breath heavy with the odors of dental decay was not considered unusual or particularly noteworthy, but simply another element in the complex mixture of scents that filled cafes, theaters, and drawing rooms. People had learned to accept and ignore these unpleasant odors, just as they accepted the smell of smoke, perspiration, and heavy perfumes that characterized public spaces during this era. The expectation that everyone should have fresh, clean breath simply did not exist in a culture where dental hygiene was barely understood and rarely practiced. A woman might spend hours perfuming her dress and powdering her face to create an impression of refinement and beauty, yet when she leaned close to speak with someone, the scent of dental neglect would drift unmistakably from her mouth. This contradiction was so common and widespread that it attracted no comment or surprise from anyone who encountered it, because virtually everyone shared the same problems and limitations. Among the various crude methods that people employed in their attempts to clean their teeth, powdered charcoal was perhaps the most popular and widely accepted. The black dust would stain fingers and lips during application, leaving visible traces across cloths and washing basins that served as evidence of these efforts at oral care. The charcoal scraped harshly against teeth, removing accumulated food particles and surface stains, but it also removed precious enamel that could never be replaced once it was worn away. The rough texture of charcoal caused sensitivity and pain that increased over time, but people interpreted this discomfort as a positive sign that the treatment was working effectively to clean and purify their mouths. Salt produced similar effects, leaving gums raw and sometimes bleeding from the harsh treatment. But this pain was also welcomed as proof that the cleaning process was thorough and beneficial. Commercial toothpaste, when it was available and affordable, represented a luxury that only the wealthiest families could indulge in on a regular basis. Advertisements in fashionable magazines showed images of gleaming white smiles and promised health and beauty, through the miracles of modern dental science, but the high cost of these products meant that they remained distant aspirations for most women, rather than practical solutions to their oral health problems. For the vast majority of Parisian women, these commercial products were glimpses of a different world that they could admire from a distance, but never actually experience in their own lives. Inside their own homes, they continued to rely on salt, charcoal, or nothing at all, accepting the limitations of their circumstances while longing for the perfect smiles that seemed to exist only in advertisements and among the very wealthy. The dental profession itself was still viewed with considerable suspicion and fear by most people, who associated dentists with pain, expense, and procedures that were often more harmful than helpful. Very few women visited dental professionals unless severe pain forced them to seek help, and even then they often delayed until the situation had become desperate and potentially dangerous. Dental treatment during this period was indeed often brutal and traumatic, involving extractions without proper anesthesia and procedures that caused enormous suffering without providing much in the way of lasting relief or improvement. Preventive dental care was virtually unknown, and most practitioners focused on removing damaged teeth rather than trying to preserve and protect healthy ones. The result was that most women's mouths were filled with cavities, infections, and missing teeth that were simply accepted as normal and inevitable aspects of aging. Because these conditions were so widespread and universal, they attracted no particular notice or concern. To smile while showing gaps where teeth had been extracted, or to cover the mouth while laughing to hide dental problems, was considered ordinary behavior rather than evidence of preventable health problems. The foods that were commonly consumed during this period contributed significantly to the deterioration of dental health throughout the population. Bread was often coarse and gritty, filled with particles from mills that acted like sandpaper against tooth enamel with every meal. Cheap sweets made with adulterated ingredients were readily available and popular, but they clung stubbornly to teeth and gums, providing perfect conditions for bacterial growth and tooth decay. Without any effective methods for removing these harmful substances from their mouths after eating, women found that dental problems developed quickly and worsened steadily over time. They learned to accept toothaches, swollen gums, and persistent pain as simply part of life, no different from headaches or fatigue. Conditions that had to be endured, rather than prevented or treated effectively. The social consequences of poor dental health were surprisingly minimal in a society where virtually everyone shared the same problems and limitations. At crowded social gatherings, where people were pressed closely together in poorly ventilated spaces, the smell of dental decay became just another element in the complex atmosphere of the event, no more noteworthy than the odors of perspiration, tobacco smoke, or heavy perfumes that filled the air. Women learned to manage their dental problems through careful behavior and strategic use of other cosmetic tools. They might avoid certain foods that caused pain, speak softly to minimize the visibility of missing teeth, or use perfumes and breath fresheners to mask the most obvious odors. These adaptations allowed them to maintain social appearances while dealing privately with conditions that could be quite painful, and limiting pharmacies and commercial establishments offered various powders and rinses that promised to freshen breath and improve oral health. But these products were typically purchased only for special occasions like weddings or important social events, rather than for regular daily use. Most of these commercial remedies were designed to provide temporary cosmetic improvements rather than genuine health benefits, masking problems rather than solving them. The fundamental disconnect between dental health and overall health meant that serious infections and medical complications that originated in the mouth were rarely traced back to their actual sources. Women might suffer from persistent headaches, unexplained fevers, or general feelings of illness that were actually caused by dental infections spreading through their bloodstream. But doctors of the period lacked the knowledge to make these connections and typically prescribed rest or tonics rather than addressing the underlying oral health problems. The cycle of neglect. Pain and resignation continued year after year without interruption as women learned to accept dental problems as permanent aspects of their lives rather than as temporary conditions that might be prevented or improved through proper care. Only much later, with advances in dental science and the gradual availability of better tools and treatments, would these particular... For the women of 1920s Paris, however, mouths full of decay, infection, and pain remained hidden behind painted faces and carefully controlled social behavior, another aspect of physical reality that was considered too unpleasant and improper for public discussion or acknowledgement. The contrast between the sophisticated appearance that these women maintained in public and the dental health problems they endured in private represents another striking example of how cultural priorities during this period consistently favored surface appearances over genuine health and well-being. From these hidden problems of dental neglect and decay, attention turns to another aspect of women's health that was equally shrouded in silence and cultural taboo, where the most basic biological functions were managed through improvised methods that created serious risks to health while remaining completely invisible to public view and social awareness. Menstrual care in Paris during these years reveals perhaps the most hidden and dangerous corner of women's daily existence, shaped by profound silence, rigid cultural modesty, and practices that would be considered deeply unsafe and unhealthy by any modern standard of feminine hygiene. Commercial disposable pads did not yet exist in forms that were accessible to most women, and tampons had not entered the marketplace as practical options for ordinary feminine use. Instead, cloth remained the only available solution for managing menstruation. But this cloth was rarely new or specifically designed for this intimate purpose. Pieces of old linen, worn cotton, or scraps of household fabric that had served other purposes were repurposed and folded into makeshift pads that were fastened awkwardly inside undergarments with whatever means were available. These improvised solutions were reused month after month, washed by hand when possible, and dried discreetly in locations where they would not be seen by others, particularly by male family members who were never supposed to be aware that such things existed. The cloth itself carried its own problems and limitations that made this system both uncomfortable and potentially dangerous to health. Old garments that were converted into menstrual cloths had usually been worn and washed many times before being repurposed, leaving the fibers weakened, thin, and never entirely clean, no matter how much effort was put into washing them. These fabrics retained stains and residues from their previous uses, and they carried within their fibers the accumulated bacteria and contamination that no amount of scrubbing could completely eliminate. Once these makeshift pads became soiled during use, they had to be rinsed and scrubbed by hand, usually in cold water, since heating water required extra fuel that many families could not afford to use for such purposes. Soap was applied sparingly, if at all, since scented bars were expensive, and harsh soaps could damage the already fragile cloth that had to last for many cycles of use. Even when cleaning was attempted with the best intentions and whatever resources were available, the cloth never achieved anything approaching true cleanliness or freshness. Drying these washed cloths presented yet another layer of difficulty and potential danger. The demands of modesty meant that menstrual cloths could not be hung openly in sunlight, where heat and natural sterilization might have helped to eliminate bacteria and restore some measure of safety to the fabric. Instead, these intimate items had to be dried in shaded corners, behind curtains, or in poorly ventilated indoor spaces where air circulation was minimal and dampness lingered for extended periods. This hidden drying process meant that moisture remained trapped in the cloth for hours or days, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth and the development of infections that would be transferred directly to the most vulnerable and sensitive areas of women's bodies. The very concealment that cultural modesty demanded actually made these essential items of feminine hygiene far more dangerous than they needed to be, turning what should have been protective measures into sources of infection and illness. The profound social silence that surrounded all aspects of menstruation meant that mothers rarely provided adequate guidance or instruction to their daughters about how to manage these monthly challenges safely and effectively. When a young girl experienced her first menstrual period, she was often handed a piece of cloth without explanation, encouragement, or practical advice about how to use it properly or care for it afterward. This lack of education and preparation meant that trial and error became the primary method of learning, with inevitable mistakes and problems along the way. Cloth that was positioned incorrectly might allow embarrassing leaks that stained clothing and caused social humiliation. Fabric that was not cleaned or dried properly might cause infections that led to pain, fever, and long-term health complications. Yet the shame and cultural taboos that surrounded these matters meant that girls were left to figure out these complex challenges entirely on their own, without guidance from the older women who could have helped them avoid the most dangerous mistakes. The physical consequences of these improvised and inadequate menstrual management systems were severe and long-lasting, though they were rarely connected to their actual causes by either the women who suffered from them or the medical professionals who occasionally treated their symptoms. Persistent rashes developed in areas where damp, contaminated cloth rubbed against sensitive skin for days at a time. Infections took hold in intimate areas, causing swelling, burning, pain, and fever that could last for weeks. Beyond the end of the menstrual period itself, many women lived with constant irritation and discomfort that they simply accepted as natural and inevitable aspects of their monthly cycles, never realizing that their suffering was caused by preventable hygiene problems rather than by inherent biological processes. Doctors who encountered patients suffering from these infections seldom made the connection between menstrual care practices and the health problems they were treating, instead attributing the symptoms to vague concepts like weak constitution, nervous temperament, or the mysterious frailties that were believed to be natural aspects of feminine biology. The cultural framework that defined menstruation as something shameful and unnatural meant that even severe health problems related to menstrual care were rarely discussed openly or treated as serious medical conditions. Women were expected to endure whatever discomfort and pain their monthly cycles brought, treating suffering as an inevitable burden of femininity rather than as a signal that something was wrong and needed to be addressed. At pharmacies during this period offered various powders and ointments that were marketed as treatments for women's discomfort and feminine complaints, but these products were designed to mask symptoms rather than address the underlying hygiene problems that were causing infections and irritation. Some women attempted to reduce odor and moisture by sprinkling talcum powder directly onto their makeshift cloth pads, but this created clumpy, irritating mixtures that often made problems worse rather than better. Others tried applying perfumes or scented oils to their bodies or their cloth pads in attempts to mask the odors that inevitably developed when the same fabric was used repeatedly without adequate cleaning. But these chemical applications often caused additional irritation and burning in areas that were already inflamed and sensitive from poor hygiene practices. For families with limited resources, the challenges of managing menstruation safely became even more difficult and dangerous. Many poor women had access to only 1 or 2 pieces of cloth that could be used for menstrual protection, meaning that when these items were in use, there were no clean alternatives available. This forced women to remain essentially housebound during their menstrual periods, unable to work, shop, or participate in social activities until their limited supply of cloth could be washed and dried sufficiently for reuse. The economic consequences of this isolation were real and significant, though they were never acknowledged as problems that deserved social attention or solutions. Women lost wages, missed important family and community events, and found their lives severely restricted by the practical limitations of inadequate menstrual care. Yet these burdens were treated as natural aspects of feminine experience rather than as preventable hardships that better resources and knowledge could have eliminated, even in wealthier households where resources were more abundant. The fundamental problems of cultural silence and inadequate knowledge meant that menstrual care remained dangerous and uncomfortable. Servants might be tasked with washing and caring for their mistresses' menstrual cloths, but this arrangement added additional layers of shame and secrecy to processes that were already shrouded in silence and embarrassment. The persistent cultural taboos meant that even women who had access to better materials and more resources were still operating without adequate knowledge about safety, cleanliness, or health, leaving them vulnerable to the same infections and complications that affected their poorer counterparts. Though they might have had better access to medical care when problems became severe enough to require professional attention. The broader tragedy of menstrual care during this period lies not just in the physical suffering that inadequate hygiene caused, but in the way that cultural silence and shame prevented women from sharing knowledge, seeking help, or working together to develop better solutions to these universal challenges. Each woman faced her monthly cycles in isolation, reinventing imperfect solutions and enduring preventable problems while remaining unaware that thousands of other women were struggling with identical difficulties. This enforced silence meant that improvements in menstrual care came slowly and unevenly, dependent on individual innovation rather than shared knowledge and collective problem-solving. The cultural framework that treated menstruation as something shameful and unnatural effectively prevented the kind of open discussion and practical cooperation that could have led to better, safer methods of managing these essential aspects of women's health and daily life. From these hidden dangers of inadequate menstrual care, where improvised cloth pads created risks that no woman dared to discuss, attention shifts to the public realm, where even the most basic human needs became sources of daily humiliation and health problems that shaped how women could move through the city and participate in public life. Public restrooms designed specifically for women were virtually non-existent throughout Paris during these years, creating a daily ordeal that shaped how women planned their activities, limited their freedom of movement, and contributed to serious health problems that were never acknowledged as preventable consequences of urban planning that ignored women's basic physiological needs. The city had invested considerable resources in providing urinals and public conveniences for men, which could be found on street corners and in parks throughout the metropolitan area. But women were simply expected to manage their needs through private arrangements and personal ingenuity. To relieve themselves when away from home, women had to navigate a complex and often humiliating system of makeshift solutions that ranged from begging strangers for access to private facilities to paying for unwanted food or drinks at cafes, simply to gain the right to use their restrooms, to carrying portable chamber pots hidden beneath their voluminous skirts. Each of these alternatives presented its own difficulties and embarrassments, turning what should have been a simple biological function into a source of daily stress and planning that consumed mental energy and restricted women's ability to participate fully in public life. The elaborate clothing styles that were fashionable during this period made these challenges even more difficult and time-consuming to manage. The long skirts, multiple layers of undergarments, and complex fastening systems that defined feminine fashion were designed with appearance and modesty in mind, but they made privacy and quick relief nearly impossible to achieve in public settings. Unlike men who could quickly and discreetly use the abundant public urinals that were scattered throughout the city, Women needed enclosed spaces and considerable time to manage their layered clothing, yet such accommodations were rarely provided. Some determined women carried small portable chamber pots with them when they ventured out for extended periods, concealing these vessels beneath their wide skirts and using them when they could find sufficiently private corners or secluded areas. This practice was awkward, uncomfortable, and fraught with the potential for embarrassing accidents or discovery, but it represented the most practical solution available to women who refused to limit their activities based on the availability of appropriate facilities. The result of these impossible circumstances was that many women learned to restrict their fluid intake severely when they planned to be away from home for extended periods, sipping water or tea cautiously while calculating how long they could safely remain in public before their bodies would demand relief. This chronic dehydration and deliberate restriction of normal fluid intake had serious health consequences that were never connected to their actual cause, the absence of appropriate public facilities for women, before leaving their homes each morning. Women would carefully plan their routes and activities around the locations of cafes, shops, or private homes, where they might be able to gain access to facilities if necessary. Spontaneous outings or changes of plan became nearly impossible, since women needed to know in advance where they might find relief if their bodies demanded it during the course of their activities. The disparity between the treatment of men and women in urban planning was obvious and undeniable to anyone who cared to notice it. Paris provided hundreds of public urinals specifically for men, visible reminders that the city recognized and accommodated male physiological needs as natural and legitimate aspects of urban life. These facilities allowed men to pause briefly during their activities and continue on their way without interruption or planning, taking for granted a level of freedom and convenience that was completely unavailable to women. Women walked past these masculine conveniences daily, unable to use them, and aware that no equivalent accommodations had been made for their own needs. The message was clear and unmistakable that male comfort and convenience were considered important aspects of urban design, while female needs were either ignored entirely or dismissed as private problems that should be solved through individual effort rather than public accommodation. The medical consequences of this systematic neglect were severe and long-lasting, though they were rarely attributed to their true cause. Women who routinely restricted their fluid intake or held their urine for extended periods developed bladder infections, kidney problems, and chronic pain that could persist for years. These conditions were typically treated as individual health problems rather than as predictable consequences of urban planning that failed to accommodate women's basic physiological needs. Doctors who encountered female patients suffering from urinary tract infections or kidney complications rarely questioned whether the underlying cause might be related to inadequate public facilities or the social restrictions that prevented women from relieving themselves when their bodies required it. Instead, these health problems were attributed to feminine weakness, nervous conditions, or the mysterious frailties that were believed to be natural aspects of women's biology, leaving the actual causes unexamined and unaddressed. At social gatherings and public events, the absence of appropriate facilities created additional layers of discomfort and social anxiety that women were expected to manage gracefully and invisibly. During long theatrical performances, elaborate dinner parties, or extended religious services, women sat in careful stillness, managing their body's needs through willpower and endurance, while maintaining the serene and composed demeanor that society expected from properly raised ladies. The fear of embarrassing accidents or visible discomfort added psychological stress to physical discomfort, creating a complex web of anxiety and self-consciousness that shaped how women experienced and participated in public life. Many women avoided certain social activities entirely, rather than risk the humiliation of needing relief when none was available, limiting their social connections and opportunities for cultural enrichment. For women from poorer families, the challenges were even more severe and the consequences more serious. They could not afford to purchase unnecessary food or drinks at cafes simply to gain access to facilities, nor did they have the social connections that might have provided access to private homes during emergencies. Street work, long hours in factories or extended periods at outdoor markets left them with no safe or appropriate options for managing their physiological needs, forcing them to endure pain and discomfort that could lead to serious health problems. Many working-class women developed chronic urinary tract infections and kidney complications that went untreated because they lacked access to medical care, creating a cycle of illness and suffering that was directly related to the absence of basic sanitary accommodations in public spaces. Their voices were the least likely to be heard in discussions of urban planning or social reform, and their needs were the most likely to be ignored or dismissed as unimportant. The irony of this situation becomes particularly sharp when we consider that Paris during this period was actively promoting itself as a model of modern urban development and progressive social thinking. The city that boasted of its wide boulevards, elegant architecture, and sophisticated cultural institutions was simultaneously failing to provide the most basic accommodations for half of its population, forcing thousands of women into daily routines of discomfort, restriction, and health-damaging behavior. Efforts to address these problems came slowly and faced considerable resistance from cultural attitudes that dismissed women's physiological needs as either unimportant or inappropriate subjects for public discussion and policy making. A few social reformers and women's rights advocates began to raise these issues in newspapers and public forums, calling attention to the ways that inadequate public facilities restricted women's freedom and damaged their health. But their voices were often ignored or ridiculed by people who considered such concerns trivial compared to what they saw as more important political and social issues. The scarcity of public toilets for women forced them into daily routines of begging, improvisation, and dangerous postponement that caused lasting damage to their health while remaining invisible to public awareness and policy consideration. This systematic neglect represented more than simple oversight or practical limitations. It revealed fundamental assumptions about whose needs mattered in urban planning and whose comfort was considered important enough to deserve public accommodation and resources. From these public struggles with basic sanitation needs, attention turns back to private spaces, where social gatherings that appeared elegant and refined on the surface created their own hidden health risks through practices that prioritized appearance over safety, leaving women vulnerable to infections that were never connected to their glamorous origins. Grand parties and social gatherings in Paris during these glittering years represented the pinnacle of urban sophistication and cultural refinement, dazzling international observers with their displays of fashion, music, and elaborate hospitality. Yet behind the glamour of chandeliers, champagne, and orchestras lay hidden costs to women's health that were never acknowledged or discussed, creating dangerous conditions that were disguised as the height of elegance and social success. To attend these magnificent events, women dressed themselves in elaborate gowns that required multiple layers of fabric, complex corsetry, and tight-fitting undergarments that created beautiful silhouettes while trapping heat and moisture against their skin throughout long evenings of dancing and socializing. The fashion demands of the period meant that these garments could not be easily removed or adjusted during the course of an evening, leaving women's bodies pressed into restrictive clothing for hours at a time, while they perspired through intensive physical activity in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Hours of energetic dancing in ballrooms filled with hundreds of other people created conditions where women's bodies became thoroughly soaked with perspiration, yet the social expectations and practical limitations of their elaborate clothing made it nearly impossible to change or refresh themselves during the event. The moisture that accumulated throughout these long evenings had nowhere to escape, becoming trapped between skin and fabric in perfect conditions for bacterial growth and infection. Social expectations of the period also contributed to the health risks that women faced at these gatherings. They were taught that undressing too quickly after physical exertion could cause dangerous chills or sudden illness, medical beliefs that discouraged them from removing damp clothing even when they returned home exhausted and thoroughly soaked with perspiration. As a result, many women went to bed in undergarments that were still wet with sweat, or they hung up elaborate gowns without allowing them to dry properly before wearing them again at the next social event. What appeared to observers as elegant, refined behavior was actually a perfect recipe for the kinds of infections and health problems that would plague women for days or weeks after these supposedly delightful social occasions. The combination of trapped moisture, restricted air circulation, and prolonged contact between contaminated fabric and sensitive skin created ideal conditions for bacteria to multiply and spread. Though the connection between social activities and subsequent illness was rarely made by the women who suffered these consequences, the elaborate layers of fabric that created such beautiful visual effects also prevented air from circulating properly around women's bodies, making it impossible for perspiration to evaporate naturally, as it would under more practical clothing arrangements. Silk and velvet, while gorgeous to look at and luxurious to touch, were particularly problematic because they absorbed moisture readily but released it very slowly, creating garments that remained damp long after the activities that had caused the perspiration in the first place. Corsets and other restrictive undergarments made these problems even worse by pressing damp cloth directly against skin and holding it there without any possibility of movement or air circulation. The tight lacing and rigid construction that created the desired feminine silhouette also created perfect conditions for bacteria to thrive in warm, moist enclosed spaces where they could multiply undisturbed for hours at a time. The fear of catching cold that dominated medical thinking during this period actually made women more vulnerable to infection rather than protecting them from illness. After spending entire evenings in damp, contaminated clothing, women were advised to avoid sudden changes of temperature or clothing that might shock their systems and cause them to become ill. Following this misguided medical advice, they often kept their bodies wrapped in the same moisture-laden garments that were actually causing the health problems they were trying to prevent. The repetitive nature of social seasons made these health risks even more serious and cumulative over time. During periods when balls, parties, and social events occurred on consecutive nights, women often found themselves wearing the same gowns multiple times before they had adequately dried or been cleaned, layering new perspiration on top of previous contamination, in ways that created increasingly dangerous conditions for their health and comfort. The same elegant gown that had been worn to one gathering might be pulled from a wardrobe and worn again the following evening, carrying with it the accumulated moisture, bacteria, and chemical residue from perfumes that had been applied to mask odors from previous wear. Each reuse compounded the health risks, creating garments that looked beautiful on the surface, but were actually becoming more dangerous with every wearing. Inside the venues where these social events took place, the conditions themselves contributed to the health problems that women would experience afterward. Ballrooms were typically crowded far beyond their capacity to provide adequate air circulation, filled with hundreds of people engaged in vigorous physical activity under gaslights or early electric lighting that generated additional heat and made the atmosphere even more oppressive and uncomfortable. The air in these spaces became thick with the combined exhalation, perspiration, and perfumes of all the people present, creating an atmosphere that was both intoxicating and potentially unhealthy for anyone who spent extended periods breathing it. Women's elaborate gowns absorbed not only their own perspiration, but also the airborne moisture and contamination from everyone else in the room, turning their clothing into collectors for whatever bacteria and illness might be present in the crowd. By the end of long evenings spent in these conditions, women carried home with them not just memories of waltzes and champagne, but also invisible threats to their health that would manifest in the days and weeks that followed as unexplained infections, persistent discomfort, and mysterious illnesses that seemed to appear randomly but were actually predictable consequences of the very social activities that were supposed to represent the height of civilized entertainment. The silence that surrounded women's health problems meant that these connections between social gatherings and subsequent illness were never made or discussed, even when the patterns were obvious to anyone who might have cared to notice them. Women might share vague complaints about feeling tired or unwell after particularly active social seasons, but they avoided the specific details that might have revealed the actual causes of their discomfort, maintaining the cultural silence that protected social appearances while leaving health problems unaddressed and untreated. Medical professionals of the period, when they encountered women suffering from infections or illnesses that appeared shortly after social events, typically attributed these problems to overexertion, nervous excitement, or the general strain of maintaining active social lives, rather than examining the specific conditions that might have created opportunities for bacterial infection and disease. Transmission. The pharmaceutical and medical supply industries recognized the commercial opportunities presented by women's recurring health problems, developing and marketing various powders, tonics, and herbal remedies that promised to ease the discomfort and illness that seemed to follow inevitably after periods of intensive social activity. These products offered temporary symptom relief without addressing the underlying causes of the problems, creating markets for treatments that would not have been necessary if the root causes had been acknowledged and addressed. Women learned to anticipate and prepare for the health problems that would follow social events, stocking their medicine cabinets with powders for infection, tonics for fatigue, and herbal teas for digestive problems that seemed to appear regularly after periods of party-going and social entertainment. This acceptance of illness as an inevitable consequence of social participation reveals how normalized these preventable health problems had. Perfume that was marketed as a symbol of beauty and refinement became, in the desperate hands of women lacking better alternatives, a weapon of self-destruction that created far more serious problems than those it was meant to solve. The sweet scents that filled ballrooms and social gatherings concealed private suffering that was never acknowledged or addressed, representing another layer of the profound contradictions that characterized Parisian society's treatment of women's health and dignity. During this period, from these dangerous applications of perfume to intimate areas of the body, attention shifts to the undergarments themselves, where fashion choices that prioritized appearance over function left women's most vulnerable areas exposed to contamination and infection that could have been prevented through better design and understanding of basic protective needs. Undergarments during the 1920s in Paris were designed primarily as fashion statements and tools for creating desired silhouettes, rather than as protective barriers that might shield women's bodies from the contamination and bacteria that filled urban environments. Many styles of underwear featured elaborate lacework, delicate mesh panels, and decorative elements that looked beautiful in shop windows, but offered virtually no practical protection against the realities of daily life. In a crowded, dusty, and often unsanitary city, perhaps most dangerously, many pairs of women's underwear were manufactured without proper lining in the crotch area, featuring only a single layer of fragile, decorative fabric between the most sensitive parts of the female body and the outside world. This design choice prioritized visual appeal and delicate appearance over basic protective function, leaving women's intimate areas vulnerable to direct contact with whatever dirt, bacteria, and contamination they encountered throughout their daily activities. Once worn in the harsh conditions of Parisian streets, where dust, animal waste and industrial pollution filled the air and settled on clothing and bodies, these inadequately designed undergarments quickly revealed their fundamental flaws and dangerous limitations. The single layer of lace or thin cotton that constituted the entire barrier between sensitive genital tissues and environmental contamination allowed bacteria and irritants to pass easily through the fabric, creating direct contact between harmful substances and areas of the body that were least equipped to defend against infection and chemical damage. The problem was made significantly worse by the fact that hygiene practices throughout the city were already severely compromised by limited access to clean water, inadequate washing facilities, and cultural beliefs that discouraged frequent cleaning. Women who walked through streets filled with horse manure, industrial smoke, and human waste found that their inadequately designed undergarments provided no meaningful protection against the accumulation of these contaminants in the most sensitive and vulnerable areas of their bodies. Without proper protective lining in their underwear, women experienced immediate and persistent irritation as dirt and bacteria collected against sensitive skin throughout the day, leading to itching, burning sensations, and inflammatory reactions that could develop into serious infections if left untreated. Yet these symptoms were seldom attributed to inadequate clothing design, since most women assumed that discomfort and irritation were natural consequences of urban living, rather than preventable problems that could be solved through better undergarment construction. The fabrics that were chosen for these decorative undergarments made the situation even more dangerous and uncomfortable for the women who wore them. Lace and mesh, while considered elegant and visually appealing, were particularly unsuitable for intimate wear because they created texture and structure that trapped moisture instead of absorbing it, while providing multiple small openings through which bacteria and irritants could pass directly to skin. Unlike cotton fabrics that might have offered some degree of absorbency and protection, these decorative materials prioritized fashion over function in ways that left women constantly vulnerable to irritation and infection. Perspiration from daily activities, combined with the contamination that accumulated from environmental exposure, collected in the intricate patterns of lace and mesh, creating persistent dampness and perfect breeding. Conditions for bacteria that could cause immediate discomfort and long-term health problems. Women learned to live with constant low-level irritation and discomfort that they accepted as normal aspects of feminine experience, never realizing that their suffering was caused by preventable design flaws in garments that were supposed to protect and support their bodies. The chronic itching, burning, and redness that resulted from inadequate underwear were dismissed as personal sensitivities or environmental factors, rather than being recognized as direct consequences of clothing that failed to provide basic protective functions. The medical consequences of wearing improperly designed undergarments were serious and often long-lasting, though they were rarely connected to their actual causes by either the women who suffered from them or the healthcare providers who treated their symptoms. Persistent irritation and inflammation in genital areas often progressed to more serious infections that could spread to internal reproductive organs, causing chronic pain, fertility problems, and complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Urinary tract infections became routine experiences for women whose underwear provided no barrier against the bacteria that accumulated throughout daily activities. Yet these recurring health problems were typically attributed to feminine weakness or constitutional problems rather than to the obvious environmental and clothing factors that were actually responsible for creating opportunities for bacterial contamination and infection. The cultural emphasis on beauty and fashion meant that these health consequences were considered acceptable trade-offs for achieving the visual effects that society demanded from properly dressed women. Fashion magazines and social expectations praised the delicate appearance of lace and mesh undergarments, without ever mentioning the health risks that accompanied these aesthetic choices, creating a situation where women were encouraged to prioritize appearance over their own physical well-being and safety. Inside homes throughout the city, the evidence of these design problems was visible in the form of stained and odorous undergarments that carried permanent reminders of the contamination they had failed to prevent. Women attempted to clean these delicate items carefully, often without adequate soap or hot water, then wore them again while they were still slightly damp, creating additional opportunities for bacterial growth and skin irritation. The expensive nature of these fashion undergarments meant that they were often worn far beyond their safe and sanitary lifespan, as women attempted to protect their investments in costly lingerie by continuing to wear items that had become permanently contaminated and potentially dangerous to their health. The same economic pressures that made proper hygiene difficult also made it necessary to continue wearing inadequate undergarments long after they should have been discarded or replaced. For women from poorer families, the situation was even more dangerous and limited, since they often owned only 1 or 2 pairs of undergarments that had to be rotated continuously, regardless of their condition or cleanliness. With such limited options available, these essential items were often worn even when they were visibly soiled, damaged, or inadequately dried after washing, creating constant exposure to bacterial contamination and chemical irritation that could cause immediate discomfort and long-term health complications. The social and cultural silence that surrounded discussions of intimate clothing meant that these design problems and their health consequences were never seriously addressed or acknowledged as legitimate concerns that deserved attention from manufacturers, medical professionals, or social reformers. Women suffered individually and silently from problems that were actually shared by thousands of others, preventing the kind of collective awareness and action that might have led to improvements in undergarment design and manufacturing standards. The contrast between the public celebration of Parisian fashion and the private reality of health problems caused by inadequate, intimate clothing reveals another layer of the profound contradictions that characterized women's experiences during this period. The same city that was internationally recognized for its sophisticated approach to beauty and style was systematically failing to provide its female population with undergarments that could protect their health and comfort during daily activities. Fashion houses and lingerie manufacturers continued to produce and market undergarments that prioritized visual appeal over basic protective function, apparently unconcerned about the health consequences for the women who purchased and wore their products. The commercial success of these inadequate items suggests that either the health problems they caused were successfully hidden from public awareness, or that the cultural emphasis on beauty and fashion was considered more important than women's physical well-being and safety. Lace underwear without adequate protective lining left women's most sensitive areas exposed to bacterial contamination and environmental irritants that caused persistent infections and chronic discomfort. Yet these design flaws were never acknowledged as serious problems, allowing the manufacture and sale of inadequate intimate clothing to continue unchecked, while women paid the price in preventable illness and suffering from these inadequately designed undergarments that failed to protect women during their daily activities. Attention turns to the private spaces where they sought rest and recovery, only to find that even their beds and bedding presented additional sources of contamination and health risks that could not be escaped even in the supposed safety and comfort of their own homes. Bed sheets and other bedding in many Parisian homes during this period were not maintained according to any regular schedule of cleanliness, but were instead changed and washed only when special occasions demanded the appearance of freshness for guests and visitors. For ordinary daily use, linens were left unchanged for weeks or even months at a time, accumulating layers of perspiration, body oils, menstrual stains, and whatever dirt and bacteria had been carried into the bed on. Unwashed bodies and contaminated clothing, when important visitors were expected or social events required impressive appearances, did women strip their beds and replace the covers with clean linens, creating elaborate performances of cleanliness and domesticity that concealed the reality of daily neglect and contamination. This approach to bedding maintenance meant that the place where women spent approximately 1/3 of their lives seeking rest and recovery from daily activities was often the most contaminated and unhygienic surface in their entire households. Mattresses during this period were typically stuffed with straw, horsehair, or other organic materials that readily absorbed moisture, odors, and bacteria, while providing perfect breeding grounds for insects, mites, and other parasites that could cause skin irritation and spread disease. These mattresses were rarely replaced and almost never properly cleaned, becoming repositories for years of accumulated contamination that created persistent health hazards for anyone who slept on them regularly. The heavy, absorbent materials used in mattress construction meant that every drop of perspiration, every trace of menstrual blood, and every particle of dirt that had been carried into the bed over months and years of use became permanently embedded in the sleeping surface, creating conditions where harmful bacteria could thrive undisturbed and multiply into dangerous concentrations that posed serious health risks to the women who had no choice but to sleep on these contaminated surfaces night after night. Pillows presented their own category of hygiene problems as they gradually absorbed oils from hair that was treated with animal fats, powder from faces that were heavily made up, and perspiration from heads that were rarely properly washed. Over time, these pillows became yellowed and stained with accumulated contaminants. But instead of being washed or replaced, they were typically just turned over or covered with fresh pillowcases that concealed the underlying contamination without addressing the health risks it represented. Women rested their heads each night on pillows that had become saturated with months or years of accumulated grease, bacteria, and chemical residues from cosmetics and hair treatments, breathing in the musty odors and potentially harmful vapors that rose from these contaminated bedding materials throughout the hours when their bodies were supposed to be recovering from daily stress and exposure to urban pollution. The lack of regular washing meant that bed linens became permanent repositories for whatever bacteria, fungi, and parasites had been introduced by the bodies and clothing of everyone who had used the bed, creating cross-contamination between family members and ensuring that infections and skin conditions could spread easily throughout households where bedding was shared or inadequately maintained. Heavy blankets and quilts that covered these beds were particularly problematic because their size and weight made them extremely difficult to wash properly, requiring large containers, enormous amounts of hot water, and many hours of labor that most households were either unwilling or unable to provide on a regular basis. As a result, these covering materials went for years without proper cleaning, accumulating smoke from fireplaces, perspiration from bodies, and environmental contamination from urban air. Pollution that created permanent odors and potential health hazards. The visible consequences of these poor bedding practices were apparent in the health and appearance of women's skin, as persistent rashes developed along backs, shoulders, and other areas where dirty sheets rubbed against the body throughout the night. Pressure sores and skin infections appeared in warm, moist areas where contaminated bedding remained in contact with sensitive skin for extended periods, creating conditions where bacteria could multiply and cause serious health problems that were often misdiagnosed or attributed to other causes. Insects such as lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in the organic materials used for mattress stuffing and in the rarely washed fabric of sheets and pillowcases, creating persistent problems with biting, itching, and potential disease transmission that affected sleep quality and overall health in ways that were never properly acknowledged or addressed. Many women woke each morning covered with small bites and welts that they accepted as normal aspects of urban living, rather than recognizing them as signs of preventable infestations that could be eliminated through proper bedding. Maintenance. The social rules that governed household management during this period meant that appearances were far more important than actual cleanliness, creating situations where beds were dressed with fresh linens only when guests might see them, while the people who actually slept in these beds were expected to endure whatever contamination and discomfort had accumulated during periods of neglect. This approach to domestic management reflected broader cultural priorities that valued social appearances over the health and comfort of family members, particularly women who were expected to maintain household standards while receiving little support or resources for actually achieving meaningful cleanliness. Inside bedrooms throughout the city, the evidence of these neglectful practices was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Sheets carried visible outlines where bodies had lain night after night, marked by accumulated perspiration, oils, and sometimes menstrual blood that created permanent stains and odors that could not be eliminated through occasional airing or light cleaning. Mattresses sagged under the weight of absorbed moisture and accumulated debris, developing permanent impressions and odors that marked them as breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. Women attempted to manage these problems through various ineffective methods, including sprinkling perfume or powder onto bedding in hopes of masking odors, or positioning additional cloths and towels to cover the most obviously stained areas. These cosmetic approaches to bedding problems provided temporary improvements in appearance without addressing the underlying contamination that continued to pose health risks and create discomfort for everyone who used these inadequately. Maintained sleeping surfaces. The silence that surrounded discussions of intimate household practices meant that these bedding problems were never openly acknowledged or addressed, even when they caused obvious health problems and discomfort for family members. Women were expected to maintain appropriate standards of domestic management while working, within severely limited resources and cultural restrictions, that made proper bedding care nearly impossible to achieve consistently. While the medical consequences of sleeping on contaminated bedding were serious and persistent, though they were rarely connected to their actual causes by either the women who suffered from them or the healthcare providers who treated their symptoms. Respiratory problems developed from breathing contaminated air that rose from dirty mattresses and pillows, while skin infections spread through contact with bacteria-laden sheets and blankets that had not been properly cleaned in months or years. For families with limited resources, the problems associated with inadequate bedding maintenance were even more severe, since multiple family members often shared the same sleeping surfaces, creating opportunities for rapid transmission of whatever infections or parasites might be present in the contaminated materials. Children and adults sleeping together in beds that had not been properly cleaned created perfect conditions for spreading skin conditions, respiratory infections, and parasitic infestations throughout entire households, even in wealthier homes where resources might have been available for better bedding maintenance. The cultural emphasis on appearances over actual cleanliness often meant that the same neglectful practices continued, with fresh linens being reserved for guest rooms and special occasions, while family members continued to sleep on contaminated surfaces that posed ongoing risks to their health and comfort. The perfumes and powders that were applied to bedding in attempts to create pleasant fragrances often interacted with the existing contamination to create complex chemical mixtures that could cause respiratory irritation and skin reactions, particularly for women who were already suffering from various health problems related to poor hygiene and inadequate personal care. These cosmetic approaches to bedding maintenance created additional layers of potential health risks without addressing the fundamental problems of bacterial contamination and inadequate cleaning. The broader pattern of domestic management that prioritized appearances over health created a cycle where bedding problems were temporarily concealed for social purposes but never actually resolved, ensuring that women continued to sleep on contaminated surfaces that contributed to ongoing health problems, while maintaining the illusion of proper household management for anyone who might judge their domestic standards based on occasional observations on beds and bedding that were cleaned, primarily for guests rather than for daily users, created sleeping environments that were often more contaminated and dangerous than many public spaces. Yet these private health hazards remained hidden from view and acknowledgement, contributing to a wide range of health problems that were never traced back to their actual sources in inadequate domestic hygiene practices. From these contaminated sleeping environments, where even rest provided no escape from health risks, attention turns to another aspect of personal care that was equally neglected and dangerous, where the failure to maintain basic hand hygiene after intimate activities created pathways for disease transmission that spread illness invisibly throughout households and communities. Hand washing, after intimate routines and personal care activities, was virtually absent from the daily habits of most Parisian women during this period, creating conditions where bacteria and contamination spread freely through households and communities without anyone understanding or acknowledging the connections between poor hand hygiene and the illnesses that seem to appear mysteriously and strike families repeatedly throughout the Year-running water was not always available inside homes, and when it was present, it was typically used sparingly due to the expense and effort required to heat and transport water for household use. Soap, particularly the scented varieties that were considered appropriate for personal use, was treated as a luxury item reserved for special occasions when households wanted to impress visitors or create good impressions, rather than as a basic necessity for daily hygiene and health maintenance. As a result of these practical and economic limitations, women routinely handled chamber pots, adjusted menstrual cloths, cleaned intimate areas of their bodies, and cared for children's hygiene needs without ever properly washing their hands afterward. Instead of using soap and clean water, they relied on quick, ineffective gestures like wiping their fingers on their dresses, dabbing them briefly on handkerchiefs, or rinsing them quickly in cold water that was often already contaminated. From previous uses, the practice of wiping hands on clothing was so common and widespread that it was considered completely normal and unremarkable, despite the obvious fact that this method of cleaning actually spread contamination rather than eliminating it. Dresses and skirts showed the evidence of this practice in the form of faint streaks and stains near hems and sides where hands had been wiped repeatedly, yet these marks were easily concealed by the fullness and darkness of most women's clothing during this period. Handkerchiefs that were carried as symbols of refinement and proper feminine behavior became repositories for accumulated dirt, bacteria, and waste materials that were transferred from contaminated hands throughout the day. These supposedly clean cloths were folded carefully and reused repeatedly, spreading contamination each time they were touched or used, while maintaining their appearance as symbols of cleanliness and proper social behavior. The consequences of this widespread failure to maintain basic hand hygiene were severe and far-reaching, though the connections between contaminated hands and subsequent illness were rarely understood or acknowledged by the people who suffered from these preventable health problems. Bacteria and parasites spread rapidly through households as contaminated hands prepared food, touched shared surfaces, and came into contact with other family members who had no way of protecting themselves from this invisible source of infection, and disease kitchens became particularly dangerous environments where the same hands that had cleaned chamber pots and handled menstrual cloths also prepared meals and handled food that would be consumed by entire families. Without proper hand washing between these activities, bacteria and waste materials were transferred directly to food preparation surfaces and ingredients, creating widespread contamination that led to persistent digestive illnesses, food poisoning, and other health problems that seemed to strike households randomly but were actually predictable consequences of poor hygiene practices. The medical understanding of disease transmission during this period was still limited and incomplete, making it difficult for families and healthcare providers to recognize the connections between hand hygiene and the recurring illnesses that plagued households throughout the city. Instead of identifying contaminated hands as sources of bacterial transmission, people typically blamed illness on weather changes, personal weakness, environmental factors, or mysterious constitutional problems that seemed to affect some individuals more than others. Women who prepared food and cared for family members without proper hand hygiene became unwitting vectors for disease transmission, spreading infections from one family member to another and creating cycles of illness that could persist for months or years within individual households. The very care and attention that they provided to their families became sources of contamination and danger when it was not accompanied by adequate understanding of basic hygiene principles. The practical barriers to proper hand washing were significant and real, particularly for women living in crowded apartments without reliable access to running water or adequate supplies of soap and clean towels. Many households depended on water that had to be carried manually from distant sources, making frequent hand washing seem wasteful and impractical when resources were already stretched to meet basic survival needs. Shared washing facilities that were located outside individual apartments, often in courtyards or basement areas that were cold, dark, and uninviting, discouraged frequent use and made hand washing seem like a major undertaking rather than a simple daily habit. During winter months, when these facilities might be partially frozen or extremely uncomfortable to use, Hand-washing became even more infrequent and inadequate. For wealthier women who had access to better resources and facilities, cultural habits and social expectations often prevented them from developing proper hand hygiene routines. Perfumed soaps were treated as decorative items to be displayed for guests rather than used for daily cleaning, and the belief that excessive washing might damage delicate skin discouraged frequent hand washing, even when resources were available to support better hygiene practices. The rhythm of daily life, with its constant movement between different tasks and responsibilities, made regular hand washing seem impractical and time-consuming to women who were already overwhelmed by household duties, childcare responsibilities, and social obligations. The idea of stopping to wash hands properly after each potentially contaminating activity seemed excessive and unnecessary when everyone around them followed similar practices and seemed to survive without obvious immediate consequences. At social gatherings and public events, the absence of hand hygiene facilities and the cultural emphasis on maintaining social appearances meant that women shared food, shook hands, and engaged in close physical contact without any opportunity to clean their hands, even when they were aware that they might be carrying contamination from earlier activities. The potential for disease transmission in these social settings was enormous, though it remained completely invisible and unacknowledged. Pharmacies and commercial establishments offered very limited options for hand cleaning and sanitation, since the scientific understanding of bacteria and disease transmission had not yet developed to the point where hand sanitizers or disinfectants were widely available or properly formulated. The few products that were marketed for hand cleaning were typically perfumed spirits or herbal preparations that were designed more for fragrance than for actual antimicrobial effectiveness. Children growing up in households where proper hand hygiene was not practiced learned by observation and imitation to follow the same inadequate routines, ensuring that poor hygiene habits were passed from one generation to the next without question or improvement. Schools and educational institutions rarely provided facilities or instruction for proper hand washing, leaving children to continue the same harmful practices they had learned at home. For poorer women, the risks were even greater since they had fewer resources for replacing contaminated grooming tools, less access to clean water and soap for wound care, and no possibility of consulting medical professionals until infections had become critical. Their deaths were the least likely to be investigated or understood, leaving their families to grieve without comprehension and their communities to continue the same dangerous practices that had caused the tragedies. The broader tragedy of these preventable deaths lies not only in the individual lives that were lost, but in the way that ignorance and cultural silence prevented society from recognizing and addressing the systematic problems that were causing these recurring tragedies. Each death that resulted from infected grooming wounds represented a failure of knowledge, resources, and social support that could have been prevented through better education, improved tools, and more open discussion of intimate health and safety issues. Deaths from sepsis that began with minor grooming accidents revealed the deadly consequences of combining poor hygiene practices with cultural silence about women's intimate care needs. These unnecessary tragedies could have been prevented through basic knowledge about disinfection and wound care. Yet the social taboos that surrounded these topics ensured that dangerous practices continued unchallenged and that preventable deaths were accepted as mysterious but inevitable aspects of feminine existence. From these individual tragedies that claimed women's lives through preventable infections, attention turns to the broader social phenomenon of silence and denial that allowed these systematic health problems to continue unchallenged, creating a culture where women's suffering was normalized and hidden while society maintained its illusions of refinement and progress. The most troubling aspect of the widespread health problems that plagued Parisian women during this period was not simply their severity or frequency, but the profound cultural silence that surrounded them and prevented any serious acknowledgement or discussion of their causes and consequences. Conversations in fashionable salons, elegant cafes, and refined drawing rooms routinely touched on politics, literature, theatre, and the latest developments in art and culture, Yet one subject remained deliberately and consistently excluded from the bounds of polite discourse: the reality of women's personal hygiene and its relationship to health and well-being. The expectation that respectable women should never discuss the practical realities of washing undergarments, managing menstrual care, or maintaining intimate cleanliness was so deeply embedded in social customs that it created an entire generation of women who grew up without access to basic knowledge about their own bodies and health needs. The language and concepts necessary for discussing these essential aspects of daily life were simply not available in polite society, leaving women to navigate complex health challenges without guidance, support, or even the vocabulary needed to seek help when problems arose. This enforced silence was far more than simple modesty or social custom. It became a systematic barrier to knowledge, health improvement, and effective problem-solving that condemned countless women to unnecessary suffering and preventable illness. A mother might spend hours teaching her daughter the intricacies of proper table manners, appropriate conversation topics, or fashionable dress, yet she would provide no instruction whatever about how to wash intimate clothing safely, manage menstrual care hygienically, or recognize the signs of infections that could threaten her health and fertility. The social rules that governed respectable conversation were clear and unforgiving in their restrictions. To mention undergarments in mixed company was already considered pushing the boundaries of propriety, while to discuss menstruation or intimate cleanliness was regarded as scandalous behavior that could permanently damage a woman's reputation and social standing. Women learned early in life that certain words and topics were absolutely forbidden, and they censored themselves so completely that they often lacked even the private vocabulary needed to think clearly about their own experiences and needs. This cultural silence created a fertile environment for myths, misinformation, and dangerous practices to flourish without challenge or correction. Some women believed that washing too frequently could damage their fertility or weaken their constitution, while others thought that menstrual blood carried spiritual impurities that required special handling and concealment. When advice was offered at all, it was typically whispered between friends or passed down inconsistently within families, creating a patchwork of beliefs and practices that often contradicted each other and left women with no reliable foundation for making informed decisions about their health and hygiene. Without open discussion and reliable information, women were left to rely on trial and error, personal experimentation, and guesswork when dealing with the most intimate and essential aspects of their physical care. What one woman believed to be safe and effective might be directly contradicted by what another had learned through her own painful experience. Yet the cultural prohibitions against discussing these matters meant that these conflicts and contradictions were never resolved through open dialogue and shared knowledge. The consequences of this systematic ignorance were severe and persistent, manifesting in the form of recurring infections, chronic discomfort, persistent pain, and long-term health problems that were never properly diagnosed or treated, because the cultural silence prevented women from describing their symptoms accurately or seeking appropriate help. The very language needed to communicate about intimate health problems was considered inappropriate for polite conversation, leaving women unable to seek help even when their symptoms became severe and potentially dangerous. This cultural silence also served to protect and perpetuate dangerous practices by preventing critical examination of traditional methods and beliefs. Women who used the same menstrual cloths for several days at a time, thinking this was normal and acceptable, had no way of learning that other approaches might be safer and more hygienic. Those who applied perfume directly to intimate areas to mask odors had no access to information about the chemical burns and infections that these practices could cause. The medical profession, dominated entirely by men who were themselves products of the same cultural silence, was often unable or unwilling to address women's intimate health problems effectively. Many women avoided consulting doctors because they feared that discussing their symptoms would mark them as immodest or inappropriate, while those who did seek medical help often found that male physicians were uncomfortable discussing intimate problems and preferred to attribute symptoms to vague concepts like nervous, temperament, or feminine weakness rather than investigating specific physical causes. When women did attempt to describe their health problems to medical professionals. They often found themselves limited to euphemisms and indirect language that made accurate diagnosis nearly impossible. The cultural prohibitions against explicit discussion of bodily functions meant that both patients and doctors struggled to communicate clearly about symptoms, causes, and potential treatments, resulting in medical care that was often ineffective and sometimes harmful. The pharmaceutical and commercial industries took advantage of this cultural silence by marketing products that promised to address women's intimate health problems without requiring explicit discussion or acknowledgement of what those problems actually were. Advertisements used coded language and indirect references